Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The Water Demon of Missouri. The sun had just begun to dip beneath the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the river. I stood on the weathered wooden dock, staring out at the calm, dark waters of the Missouri River. It was peaceful here, always had been. The rippling of the river, the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees, the distant calls of birds returning to their nests, it was the kind of peace that made you believe life could go on forever in its simplicity. I wasn't originally from this part of Missouri. I moved here a few years ago, drawn by the quiet. A fresh start, or so I told myself. People in town were kind enough, but there was a certain distance. Maybe it was the river that kept them reserved. After all, it wasn't like it was the most welcoming body of water. But for me, the river had always been a place of comfort. I'd found solace in its vastness, its slow-moving waters. I often went down to the river at dusk, the time when everything seemed to take on a kind of magic. The reflection of the trees on the surface, the sound of the water gently lapping against the shore, it felt like something out of an old story, a place where nothing could hurt you, where everything just was. Sometimes, I would sit on the dock, legs dangling over the edge, and close my eyes to the world. The river had a way of making everything else fade away. It was easy to forget that there was a town just up the hill, with its little shops, its modest homes. I would lose myself in the rhythm of the water, feeling the weight of the day slip away with every ripple that passed beneath me. But that night, that was the night when everything would change. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. The night was settling in as it always did, the stars beginning to twinkle faintly above. The water seemed to stretch endlessly before me, its dark surface reflecting only the quiet whispers of the trees. I took a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs as I listened to the rhythm of the water. For a moment, everything felt as it always had, peaceful, safe, undisturbed. But then, as I shifted on the dock, I saw something. Just at the edge of my vision, near the middle of the river, a dark shape appeared. It was subtle at first, just a shadow on the water, blending in with the darkness. But it moved. Slowly, as if it was gliding across the surface, following the current. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. It was probably nothing. A log or some debris caught in the current, I told myself. But the shape, it wasn't moving like anything natural. There was something deliberate about it, something unsettling. I leaned forward, narrowing my eyes, trying to make sense of it. And then, for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something that looked like a figure, something tall, dark, and impossibly still, standing in the water. I couldn't look away from the figure. My heart began to beat faster, a subtle thrum beneath my chest that soon grew louder, as if it was trying to match the rhythm of my rising unease. The dark shape on the water hadn't moved, at least, not in the way I expected. It wasn't floating with the current. It was standing still, as if waiting. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling stiff, the peaceful atmosphere now replaced by an odd weight in the air. The quiet of the evening felt suddenly too heavy, too thick. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickle, my instincts telling me to leave, to turn and walk away, but I couldn't. Something held me there, rooted to the spot. The river was barely moving tonight, a mere whisper against the banks, but the figure, whatever it was, seemed to defy the flow of the water. It wasn't until I took a cautious step forward, the wooden planks of the dock creaking under my weight, that I realized the shape wasn't alone. I squinted, my breath coming shallow, my eyes struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. A faint ripple spread out from the shape, disturbing the surface of the river ever so slightly. But what unnerved me the most wasn't the ripple, it was the eyes. For a brief instant, I thought I saw two glowing, yellowish orbs reflecting in the water, staring straight at me from the figure's face. My pulse quickened. That had to be a trick of the light. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to be creeping into my thoughts. I'd been out here too long, maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, it moved. Just slightly, so slight it could have been nothing at all. The figure shifted, almost imperceptibly, and in that moment, the stillness of the river seemed to break, the world around me suddenly a little too loud, a little too alive. The wind picked up, a sharp gust that rushed through the trees and caused the water to stir. The figure's outline blurred for a moment, as if it were being swallowed by the darkness, but then it came into focus again, closer now, its presence undeniable. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest, but my feet wouldn't let me move. I was paralyzed by a strange compulsion, as if the figure was calling to me, pulling me in, urging me to come closer. The sense of dread that surged through me was almost suffocating, but at the same time, a part of me couldn't tear myself away from it. The river, once a peaceful place, now felt foreign, menacing. I had to know what it was. But the moment I took a step closer to the edge of the dock, the water, as if sensing my movement, shifted. A deep, low sound rose from the depths. The water beneath me seemed to churn, a subtle thrumming noise that vibrated in the air, and I froze. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to turn and run, but I found myself staring out at the dark shape once again. The figure was no longer distant, no longer an unclear shadow in the river. It was right there, so close now that I could make out the faint outline of something that resembled a head, though the rest of it was still shrouded in darkness. And then it happened. The water shifted violently. A dark shape, something huge and slick, surged forward, and the figure, whatever it was, disappeared beneath the surface. My breath caught in my throat. The calm of the river had returned, but it was no longer peaceful. There was a presence here. Something in the water. Something that wasn't supposed to be. I took a slow step back, my legs trembling beneath me, and it was only then that I realized how quiet everything had become. The wind had died, the trees were still. The world around me had become unnervingly silent. There was no sound at all. I was no longer sure if I had imagined it, but I knew one thing with certainty: whatever it was in the river, it wasn't done with me yet. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my body stiff, my mind racing. My eyes were locked on the spot where the figure had been, where the water had churned, but there was nothing now. Just the slow ripple of the current, the dark expanse of the river stretching out before me like it always had. I shook my head, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me like a thick fog. It wasn't possible. It couldn't have been real. I had been out here too long, too focused on the strange quiet of the evening. Maybe I'd just seen a log or some debris, something I couldn't properly make out in the dark. The water played tricks on the eyes, especially at night. My mind was probably just filling in the gaps, creating shadows where there were none. I let out a shaky breath, forcing my legs to move again. The dock creaked beneath me as I took a few tentative steps back. My hands trembled slightly, but I forced them to steady. "It's just your imagination," I muttered under my breath. Nothing more. I turned away from the river and glanced up at the darkening sky. The stars were beginning to appear, their soft light offering a small comfort. It was just a strange moment, a trick of the light, that was all. Nothing to be afraid of. I walked toward the path leading back to my cabin, trying to steady my breathing, to ignore the lingering sense of unease creeping at the edges of my thoughts. The night air felt colder now, a sharp contrast to the warmth that had settled over me just moments before. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, the fabric rustling softly in the breeze. The town was quiet, as usual. The lights of the small homes along the outskirts flickered in the distance, casting a soft glow against the backdrop of the darkening woods. It was a peaceful place, where nothing ever felt out of place. I quickened my pace, telling myself that whatever I had seen out there on the river wasn't real. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had heard strange stories about the river when I first moved here, about how people sometimes claim to see things in the water, but I had always dismissed them as superstition. Everyone knew that rivers could play tricks on the mind, especially at night. The dark water, the shifting shadows, it was easy for the mind to fill in the blanks with shapes and figures, to imagine something lurking just beneath the surface. There was no demon, no creature watching me from the water. I reached my cabin and closed the door behind me, the familiar creak of the wood offering a small sense of reassurance. I leaned against it for a moment, my breath still unsteady, before I turned to the kitchen and started preparing some coffee. A hot drink would help calm my nerves, help me forget about the fleeting terror that had gripped me by the river. But even as I moved through the motions of making the coffee, the feeling lingered. A gnawing thought at the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. That shape, those eyes, the way the water had churned so violently. It was all too vivid to be a mere figment of my imagination. I paused, the mug halfway to my lips, and stared out the window toward the river. The darkness had settled in thick now, the only light coming from the small porch lamp that illuminated the immediate area around the cabin. No, it was just a trick of the night. Just my mind playing games. I tried to push the thought away, forcing myself to focus on something, anything else. But even as I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, a small, lingering doubt gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the river, whatever it was that lay beneath its surface, wasn't done with me. But that was crazy. Right? It had to be. I finished my coffee in silence, the dark water of the river lingering in my thoughts, just out of reach, like a shadow waiting to return. The days that followed were uneventful, at least on the surface. The river, as it always did, flowed peacefully, and the world around me returned to its quiet routine. I tried to push the events of that night to the back of my mind, telling myself it was just an illusion, a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by fatigue or the eerie calm of the evening. After all, I had lived here for months without any problems, and I wasn't about to let some strange sighting change that. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different now, as though an invisible weight had settled on my shoulders, subtle but constant. It was easy to ignore during the day, but when night fell, when the river lay under the darkened sky, the unease would creep back in. I found myself walking the same route every evening, trying to distract myself with familiar tasks. I would check the dock, make sure everything was in place, then turn back to the cabin without lingering too long. I never went down to the water's edge after sunset anymore, avoiding the area like it was some forbidden space. But even that didn't seem to bring the relief I craved. The tension in the air never quite lifted. It was a few nights after the strange event when the first thing happened. At first, I thought I had imagined it just like before. But the more I thought about it, the more I was sure something wasn't right. I had been lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a sound from outside. At first, it was nothing, just the usual creaks and groans of the house settling, the wind rustling the trees. But then, there was a splash. Soft, distant, like someone had stepped into the water. I sat up immediately, my heart racing. I told myself it was nothing. Just an animal, perhaps. A deer, or maybe a raccoon, something harmless. But then the sound came again. This time, it was closer, and I could hear something else, a faint dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the dock. I got out of bed slowly, careful not to make a sound, and crept to the window. The night was so still, so quiet, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. I pulled the curtain back, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing there. I waited for a moment, watching the empty yard, the water glistening softly under the moonlight. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I let out a shaky breath and pulled the curtain back down. I told myself it was my imagination, that the isolation of the cabin was getting to me. The longer I lived here, the more I was starting to feel like I was losing touch with reality. The sound had been so faint, so distant, there was no reason to believe it had been anything out of the ordinary. But the following evening, the river would give me no such comfort. I had gone down to the dock at dusk, just to check the area again, a habit I'd developed after that first unsettling night. I told myself it was a routine now, nothing more. But when I reached the edge of the dock, I froze. There, floating in the water just a few feet away, was a small, withered object, an old, dark wooden paddle. It was strange. I hadn't seen it before. I'd been by the dock nearly every day, and I was sure it wasn't there earlier. It wasn't unusual for things to drift down the river, but something about it struck me as odd. I bent down, cautiously reaching for the paddle, and as my fingers brushed against it, a chill ran down my spine. It was cold, far colder than the river should have made it. Almost as if it had been pulled from an ice-cold, unseen depth. I pulled my hand back quickly, heart pounding. Something wasn't right. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been there the whole time, and I hadn't noticed it until now. Maybe the water had carried it closer overnight. But the feeling of unease refused to leave me, growing stronger with each passing second. I turned away from the river, the sense that something was watching me nearly suffocating in the air. The trees, once comforting, now seemed to whisper as the wind picked up, the rustling leaves carrying an unsettling sound, like a quiet murmur too far to fully understand. As I made my way back up the path to the cabin, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. That whatever it was in the river, whatever had been watching me, was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. That it was just my mind, playing tricks again. But I knew deep down that it wasn't. The events were beginning to stack up, and with each strange occurrence, I was losing more of my confidence. The unease that I had tried so hard to ignore was becoming impossible to deny. And the river? It felt like it was closing in on me, one ripple at a time. The days had begun to blur together, and the sense of something lurking in the water seemed to creep into every corner of my thoughts. I tried to dismiss it, tried to keep telling myself that nothing unusual had happened, but the strange events kept piling up. It was impossible to ignore them any longer. The unease had settled in like a second skin, pressing tighter with each passing day, each passing night. I hadn't been back to the river since the paddle incident. The sight of it had shaken me more than I was willing to admit, and I couldn't bear the thought of going back to the water, not with everything I had felt that night. But then, one evening, as I sat inside the cabin, I heard it. A soft, almost rhythmic sound. The unmistakable sound of something moving through the water. I froze. It was faint at first, barely audible above the rustle of the wind through the trees, but it grew louder. A splash, followed by another. There was something in the river, something moving against the current, something large. I stood up, my pulse quickening, and moved toward the window, trying to peer through the darkness. For a long moment, I saw nothing. The river was still, undisturbed, and yet the sound continued. It was so quiet now, I had to strain my ears to hear it, something like slow, deliberate steps, as if something was wading through the shallow water near the shore. I couldn't convince myself it was an animal. The rhythm was too human, too purposeful. I turned away from the window and grabbed my flashlight from the counter. My hand was trembling as I made my way toward the door. I had to see for myself. I couldn't let this fear control me anymore. The night was unusually cold, the air thick with tension. I stepped out onto the porch and shivered as the chill wrapped around me. The flashlight's beam sliced through the darkness, but it felt like it barely made a dent in the oppressive blackness surrounding me. The river was ahead, the sound still there, echoing in the distance. I approached the edge of the dock carefully, as if afraid to disturb whatever it was that lurked just beyond the light. My mind was racing, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. What if it was just the wind? What if it was some other creature, something normal, that I was overreacting to? I almost convinced myself to turn back when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a dark shape barely visible at the far side of the river, shrouded in the shadows of the trees. But then it shifted. Slowly, deliberately. A figure, tall and elongated, moving just at the water's edge. It didn't seem to be walking, it was gliding, hovering just above the surface, its form distorted by the ripples in the water. My breath caught in my throat. The shape was unmistakable. It wasn't human. Not fully. The outline was too fluid, too unnatural, bending in ways that defied logic. I felt my stomach drop, a sickening sense of dread flooding through me. I wanted to run, to retreat back into the cabin, but I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my body paralyzed as I watched the figure move closer. The flashlight's beam wavered in my hand, and for a moment, I thought I saw its eyes, glowing faintly, two yellow orbs reflecting the light. It felt like they were staring straight at me, piercing through the darkness, making me feel small and vulnerable. Then, the figure stopped. It stood still in the water, its presence overwhelming, as though it was waiting for something. For me, maybe. The wind picked up suddenly, a sharp gust that made the trees groan and the water ripple violently, breaking the silence. In that moment, the figure seemed to grow, its shape becoming more defined, as though the darkness itself was stretching around it, bending to its will. The air felt thick with something I couldn't name, something ancient, something terrifying. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel the cold sweat running down my spine. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure seemed to melt back into the darkness. One moment it was there, its form so distinct, and the next, it was gone, vanished without a trace. I stood frozen, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it a trick of the light? Had I imagined it? But I knew it wasn't my imagination. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity, my legs shaking beneath me. The world around me seemed to hold its breath. The sounds of the river, the wind, the distant rustling of the trees, all of it felt muted, as if I was no longer part of it. I slowly turned and made my way back to the cabin, my every step heavy with the weight of what I had witnessed. My thoughts were a blur, all of them racing in different directions, trying to make sense of the shadowy figure. But there was no explanation that made sense. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with shaking hands. I pressed my back to it, my heart still racing, my mind still reeling. I had known it, deep down. Something was in the river. Something that was watching me. And it was only just beginning. The following morning, I woke up exhausted, my mind clouded with the remnants of a restless sleep. The night had been filled with unsettling dreams, dark, twisted images of shadows and water, of things moving beneath the surface, watching me from the depths. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. Something I couldn't escape. I had to remind myself that it was just my imagination, that I was tired, that the isolation of the cabin was starting to get to me. After all, I had been living here for months without incident, and this strange occurrence, this figure, was probably just a product of my nerves. The river was peaceful, calm during the day. It had always been a part of the scenery, never something to fear. I went through my morning routine, trying to push away the anxiety that clung to me like a second skin. The sunlight streaming through the windows should have been comforting, but instead, it felt harsh, like it was too bright, too stark against the shadows of the night before. I couldn't help but glance toward the river as I stepped outside, hoping for reassurance. The water was still, the surface glistening under the sunlight, the usual birds chirping nearby. It looked normal. It looked safe. But the nagging sense of unease hadn't gone away. The feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching, was still there, lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts. I forced myself to walk down to the dock, telling myself that if I just faced it head on, it would all go away. I had to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of, that I was simply imagining things. I reached the end of the dock and stood there, staring at the water. For a moment, it felt almost like nothing had happened, like I was back to the days before the shadow, before the strange noises and the glowing eyes. But as I stood there, I could feel it again, the weight of something unseen, pressing down on me, just beyond my reach. I looked around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was that had been making my mind race. The trees were still. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind and the faint, distant call of birds overhead. I sighed, rubbing my hands against my face, trying to shake the exhaustion from my body. It's just the isolation, I muttered to myself. It's getting to me. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a small thing, barely noticeable at first, but as I stepped back toward the cabin, I couldn't ignore it. A subtle ripple in the water. Barely a movement, just a slight disturbance on the surface. I froze. The river had been still when I arrived, and yet now something was moving beneath the surface. I couldn't see what it was, only that the water seemed to be swirling, twisting in a pattern that didn't make sense. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. The movement stopped, as if it had never been there. I stepped back, a chill running down my spine. My mind screamed at me to rationalize it, just a fish, maybe, or some other animal that had disturbed the water, but the feeling of being watched, the sensation that something was near, was impossible to ignore. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was there. Something had been there the entire time. The river, once a source of tranquility, had become a place of unease. As the days passed, the feeling only grew stronger. Every time I went near the river, I felt it. A presence, just out of sight, lingering like a shadow at the edge of my vision. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, checking over my shoulder as I walked, as if expecting something or someone to be standing right behind me. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was all just the effect of the long, lonely days spent in isolation. But the weight of the sensation wouldn't leave me. The river wasn't just a river anymore. It had become a place where something was hiding, something that was watching me. I couldn't escape it. It was always there, like a low hum in the back of my mind, growing louder with each passing day. And with it, the fear began to grow as well, quiet, insidious, but unmistakable. I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something in the water. Something old, something waiting. And it was getting closer. The following days felt like they stretched on endlessly, the unease seeping deeper into my bones with every passing hour. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, watching, lurking in the shadows. The river, once a source of peace and solitude, had become a place of unease, and every time I ventured near it, that creeping sensation of dread gnawed at my insides. I tried to avoid it. I stayed inside the cabin as much as possible, only stepping outside when I had to. I even found myself making excuses to stay away from the water, as though I could pretend it wasn't there, as though I could outrun the growing sense of danger that clung to the very air around me. But I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it forever. It was late afternoon when I finally made myself go back. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, but the beauty of it felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else. As though I no longer had the right to appreciate it. I told myself it was just the isolation. That I was tired, on edge, and that I needed to face whatever fear had settled in my mind. I had to prove to myself that I wasn't running away. But even as I walked toward the river, I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, the suffocating sense of something unnatural, hanging over me. The closer I got to the edge of the dock, the more the air seemed to grow heavy, as if the very atmosphere was charged with some invisible force. I paused at the edge of the dock, my heart thudding in my chest, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. The water was still, but it didn't feel still. It felt alive, like it was breathing, like it was waiting. I could hear it now, the gentle lapping of the water against the shore, but the sound seemed wrong, as though it was distorted, muffled by something deeper, something hidden. I turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The beam flickered for a moment, and I almost thought it would die out. My hand tightened on the flashlight, a surge of panic rising in my chest. It was like the night itself was trying to swallow the light, to keep me from seeing. Focus, I muttered to myself, forcing my legs to move, forcing myself to step forward. I had to look. I had to prove that I was overreacting. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, its light reflecting off the water in jagged, unnatural patterns. I could see the ripples, subtle and faint, but they were there. And the shadows, there was something strange about the shadows that stretched across the river. They seemed to twist and writhe, as if the water itself was alive, moving in ways that weren't possible. Then, I saw it. A figure, distant at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. It was on the other side of the river, standing motionless at the edge of the water. I couldn't make out any details at first, just a silhouette, dark and formless, blending with the surrounding darkness. But there was no mistaking it. Something was there, something I could not see clearly, but that I could feel with every fiber of my being. A chill ran down my spine, and my breath caught in my throat. I knew this wasn't my imagination. I knew what I was seeing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, still and silent, as if watching me. I wanted to call out, to yell, to ask who or what it was, but my voice died in my throat. My feet were rooted to the spot, as though something invisible was holding me there. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but when I looked again, it was gone. The darkness beyond the water was now just that, empty, still. Nothing was there. The figure had vanished as if it had never been. My heart was racing, my mind reeling. I could feel the heat in my chest, the raw panic that rose with every breath I took. I wanted to run, to flee, to escape the suffocating terror that was beginning to seep into my soul. But I couldn't. My body refused to move. I couldn't turn away from the river. The air around me felt thicker now, heavier. The world seemed to close in, pressing down on me from all sides. I could hear my own breath, shallow and ragged, but the silence that surrounded me felt like it was closing in, suffocating me. I could still feel its presence, something that wasn't human, something that didn't belong in this world. It was there, just beyond the reach of the light, hidden in the darkness, waiting, watching. I took a step back, my mind racing with fear, and as I did, I thought I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a whisper, but too distant to make out. My body stiffened, my senses heightened to a level I hadn't known I was capable of. The air was filled with a cold, unnatural stillness, like the calm before a storm. The whispers grew louder, almost audible now. They seemed to come from all around me, from the river, from the trees, from the very ground beneath my feet. I couldn't stay here any longer. I turned and ran, my legs pumping with panic as I sprinted back toward the cabin. The darkness pressed in on me with each step, but I couldn't look back. I couldn't let whatever it was catch me. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door behind me, locking it in a frantic haze. I leaned against it, my heart still racing, my body trembling with the aftershocks of the fear that had gripped me. It wasn't over. The river wasn't just a place. It was something alive. Something that had been waiting for me. And now, I was certain it was coming for me. The days blurred together in a haze of anxiety and dread. I couldn't escape the sense that something was wrong, that the river had changed, that something was now waiting in its depths. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing motionless by the water's edge. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on me, following me, always just out of view. But even with the terror gnawing at my mind, I still tried to convince myself it wasn't real. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the mind, a product of my growing isolation and fear. The longer I stayed here, the more the line between reality and imagination seemed to blur. Maybe I had seen something, but perhaps it was just the dark playing tricks on me, the flicker of light in the distance creating the illusion of a figure. Maybe I was just paranoid. I couldn't escape the river, though. It called to me, its surface reflecting the dull, gray sky above as if it were a mirror to my anxiety. I couldn't help but keep returning, despite every instinct in my body screaming to stay away. There was something in the water, something that seemed to reach out for me, pulling me closer. Tonight, I made the mistake of going down to the river again. The air was colder than usual, a biting chill that cut through my jacket as I walked toward the dock. The full moon was high above, casting its pale light across the water, making the shadows stretch unnaturally long. There was no wind, no sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft lapping of the water against the shore. The night was still, too still, like the world was holding its breath. I stepped to the edge of the dock, feeling the familiar pang of fear tighten in my chest. The ripples were still there, subtle but persistent, moving across the water in erratic patterns. I tried to steady my breathing, to convince myself that it was just a fish or the wind, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't natural. That's why I saw it. A flash of movement in the water. At first, it was just a ripple, a subtle disruption of the surface. Then, it became clearer, something moving just beneath the surface, sliding through the water like a snake. I leaned forward, heart racing, trying to make out what it was. The water around the movement was darker, as if something was blocking the moonlight, and the shadows seemed to stretch in unnatural ways. Then, I saw it, eyes. Two glowing, pale orbs that shone through the murky water, locked on me. I froze, unable to look away. The eyes were large, too large, and they held a depth that I couldn't comprehend. They were hollow, empty, yet they felt so real, so present, as if they were staring straight into my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape the paralyzing fear that was rooting me to the spot, but I couldn't. I could only watch as the water around the eyes began to churn violently, as if something massive was rising from below. I heard a low, guttural growl, a sound that vibrated in my bones, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The water erupted. A shape, massive and dark, broke the surface, sending waves crashing against the dock. It was impossible to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure was both human and monstrous, a grotesque amalgamation of shadow and water. It was twisted, its form shifting and warping like a nightmare that had escaped from the depths of my mind. The face was contorted, a grotesque mask of features that seemed to melt and reform with each passing second. And then it moved. The shape surged toward me, the water around it bubbling and boiling as though it was alive, as though it were feeding off the terror I could feel radiating from my body. The air grew colder, the space around me warping with a pressure that felt like it was squeezing the life out of me. I could hear the sound of its movements, wet and slithering, as though the very river was alive and crawling toward me. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. The creature, it wasn't human. It wasn't even something that could belong to this world. But it was there, rising from the water, as real as the ground beneath my feet. It reached toward me, its arm outstretched, fingers long and twisted, trailing water that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. A chill ran down my spine, the terror almost paralyzing me. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The water stilled once more, the creature retreating back into the depths from which it came. The glow in the eyes faded, leaving the river once again silent and calm. I stood there for a moment, breathless, my mind struggling to process what I had just witnessed. My legs felt weak, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me as the adrenaline faded, leaving nothing but the cold fear that still gripped my chest. Was that real? I could barely breathe, my mind screaming at me to make sense of it, to rationalize it, to tell myself it wasn't real. Maybe I had imagined it, a trick of the shadows and the night. Maybe it was just my mind unraveling, driven by fear and isolation. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. And that knowledge terrified me more than anything else. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the dock as I sprinted back to the cabin, the air thick with a terror that I couldn't escape. The river was no longer just a river, it was a place of nightmares, a dark force that had awakened and was waiting for me to fall victim to it. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep running. Days passed, but the fear never quite left. It lingered, hanging in the air like an oppressive weight, suffocating any attempt at normalcy. The river had become a constant presence in my life, its dark waters always in the corner of my mind, its mysterious figure haunting my thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes, the grotesque form rising from the depths. No matter how hard I tried to push it away, the terror kept returning, more vivid each time. I had convinced myself to stay inside for a while. The air around me seemed to thicken with unease, and every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the woods, made me jump. But then, something happened that I hadn't expected. Other people began to talk about it. At first, it was subtle. Casual conversations that seemed to skirt around the edge of something darker, something unsaid. I had been picking up supplies at the local store, trying to keep to myself as much as possible, when I overheard a group of older men sitting near the counter, speaking in hushed tones. Their conversation was filled with the kind of gossip that small towns thrive on, but one word caught my ear: the figure. Some folks are saying there's something out there watching him, one of them muttered, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Something not right about that river. Been hearing stories from people who live near it. Another man chimed in, his tone grim. Ain't the first time I've heard of it. Long as I've been around, there's always been talk of things, strange things, by the water. You don't mess with the river at night, that's for sure. I froze, my blood running cold. I tried to pretend I wasn't listening, but their words were like a jagged knife twisting into my chest. I wanted to turn and walk away, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, but my feet wouldn't move. I know a fellow who saw it, the first man continued, his voice trembling slightly. Out there, late at night. Said it was like a shadow, but not quite. Looked like a person, but wrong. I don't know, but he says he'll never go near that river again. My stomach turned. I couldn't help but look over at them, my heart racing. They were speaking about something that seemed too close to the terrifying vision I had seen. The creature in the water, the eyes, the twisted figure that had haunted me. But I wasn't the only one. I could hear more voices now, people in the store murmuring, exchanging uneasy glances. Some of them shrugged it off, dismissing the talk as superstition. But there were others who seemed to believe it, their faces pale, eyes wide, as though they knew exactly what the men were talking about. People say it's a spirit, one woman added quietly, her voice barely audible. A water demon or something like that. Been around for as long as anyone can remember. They say it's vengeful. It doesn't want anyone near its river. The words hit me like a punch. Water demon. That's what they were calling it. A demon. My stomach churned again, and I felt the cold sweat creeping down my back. Was that what I had seen? A demon? I tried to shake it off, to tell myself that these were just old stories, the kind that small towns always have. People like to gossip, especially about things they don't understand. But something in the way they spoke, the fear in their voices, told me this was different. They weren't just telling stories. They were warning each other. I felt the weight of their gazes, their unspoken knowledge, like they all knew something I didn't. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I suddenly felt very small, very alone. It was as though the entire town had become aware of the same dark force, and I was the only one who hadn't fully accepted it yet. When I left the store, the conversations followed me, lingering in my mind like a dark cloud. As I walked back toward the cabin, I could feel the river calling to me again, as if it had been waiting. That night, I couldn't sleep. The darkness pressed in, suffocating, and every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made my pulse spike. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. Couldn't stop thinking about those glowing eyes, the twisted form emerging from the water. And now, it wasn't just me. It wasn't just my imagination. The whole town had felt it, had seen it in some form, and there was nowhere to hide from it. Not from the river. Not from whatever was waiting for me in the shadows. I knew I had to confront it. I had to face whatever this thing was. But deep down, I wondered if I was already too late. The night came swiftly, and with it, an overwhelming sense of inevitability. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that had been waiting for me in the depths of the river. The conversations I had overheard, the whispers in town, they all seemed to converge on the same truth. There was something out there, something I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it. That night, I made a decision. I would go down to the river, not to seek answers, but to confront the fear that had been building up inside me for weeks. I couldn't live like this any longer, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. I had to face it. I had to see it for myself. The air was still, colder than usual, and the moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale glow over the landscape. The cabin felt miles away as I stood at the edge of the river, the water stretching out before me like a dark, endless abyss. The sounds of the forest had quieted, leaving only the soft rush of the river against the shore and my own shaky breath. I tried to steady myself, to gather the courage to step closer, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn and run, but I couldn't. Something kept pulling me forward, as though the river itself was calling me. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a movement in the water that made me hesitate. But as I stared harder, my breath catching in my throat, I saw the shape take form. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the figure began to rise from the water. It was like watching a nightmare unfold before my eyes, the kind you can never escape, no matter how hard you try to wake up. The creature was massive, its form emerging from the river like some ancient, monstrous being, its body made of twisting shadows and water. Its features were indistinct, constantly shifting, like it was never meant to exist in this world. But what struck me the most, what made my blood run cold, was its face. Or rather, the lack of one. It was a featureless mask of dark water, with only glowing eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural light. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The terror was suffocating, a cold, paralyzing wave that washed over me, freezing me in place. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body refused to obey. My legs were like lead, my arms heavy at my sides. All I could do was stare, helpless, as the thing moved closer. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the fear it was inflicting. I could hear the sound of water splashing against itself as it came closer, the deep, guttural growls vibrating through the air. It wasn't just a creature. It was something more, something that existed beyond the physical realm. I could feel its presence in my bones, in the air around me, in the space between my heartbeats. It stopped just a few feet away from me, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. I could feel the pressure of its gaze, heavy and suffocating. Every breath I took felt like it was being ripped from my chest. It was like the very essence of the river had come alive, staring into me, judging me, claiming me. And then it moved. Its arm, long and twisted, reached toward me, fingers stretching out like tendrils of darkness. The water around it surged, forming shapes that should not have been possible. I could feel the cold, wet air closing in, the water's chill creeping into my skin, seeping into my bones. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shake, and for a moment, I felt like I was going to be pulled into the river itself. but I couldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. I was trapped in place, locked in place by some unseen force. My eyes burned from the glare of the creature's eyes. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, but still, I couldn't scream. I couldn't do anything but stand there and watch as the creature drew closer. It was as if time itself had slowed, stretching out the moments in a horrible, agonizing way. The arm reached out further, closer, and I could feel the water slick against my skin as if it were pulling me toward it. A low, guttural voice filled the air, though it didn't come from the creature's mouth. It seemed to come from everywhere, from the river, from the very earth beneath my feet. "You are mine," it whispered, the words sinking into my mind like a poison. The voice was not human, too deep, too ancient, too wrong. It reverberated through me, shaking me to the core. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The creature's hand was just inches from me, its fingers curling like claws, ready to snatch me from the world I knew. I could feel its presence in my head, in my soul, like it was inside me, wrapping around my thoughts, squeezing the life out of them. Then, with a suddenness that made my heart stop, it stopped. The hand retreated. The eyes faded, the glow dimming to nothing. The creature, the water demon, slowly sank back into the river, its form dissolving into the shadows, the night swallowing it whole. I was left standing there, trembling, my body finally releasing from the paralysis that had held me captive. My chest heaved with ragged breaths, my heart pounding in my ears, but I couldn't move. Couldn't even make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real? The terror that gripped me, the suffocating weight of fear, it had been real. I knew it. I could still feel its cold touch on my skin, still hear its voice whispering in my mind. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination. It was real. And I had no idea how to escape it. With every ounce of strength I had, I turned and ran. My legs burned, my mind screamed at me to keep moving, to get away, but I couldn't outrun what had just happened. The image of the water demon, the eyes, the voice, it all burned into my memory. I didn't stop running until I was back at the cabin, the door slamming behind me, the lock clicking into place. But even then, even locked away from it, I could feel its presence lingering, the river calling to me, waiting for me to return. And I knew it wouldn't let me go. Not now. Not ever. The fear that had gripped me after my encounter with the demon didn't fade with time. It settled in, an ever-present weight pressing down on my chest, squeezing my breath with every passing hour. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. The darkness outside my window felt like it was creeping closer with every second, and even the stillness of the cabin seemed to hum with a strange energy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. Every corner of the room, every creak of the floorboards, made me jump. Every time I walked past a mirror or looked out of a window, I couldn't shake the feeling that the demon was there, lurking just beyond my sight, watching me, waiting for the next moment to strike. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. I tried to convince myself it was just a reaction to the trauma, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But every time I looked toward the river, I could feel it. It was like a pull, an invisible thread tugging at my thoughts, drawing me closer. And then there was the silence. It was a suffocating, unnatural silence. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, had all stopped. The night felt unnervingly still, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was happening. I had to find out what the hell I had seen and why I couldn't escape it. I decided to search for answers. The next morning, I headed to the local library. It was a small, dusty place tucked away in the corner of the town. The librarian, an older woman with silver hair and glasses perched on the edge of her nose, greeted me with a curious look as I stepped inside. She didn't say anything, but I could feel the weight of her gaze, as if she knew exactly why I was there. Looking for something specific? She asked after a moment of silence. I hesitated, the words suddenly feeling too heavy to speak. I'm looking for information on local legends. Strange things that happen around here. You know, folklore. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly, and I saw her glance toward the back of the library where old, worn books sat in the shadows. She nodded toward the shelves. You might find something in the back, she said quietly. But not all stories are for the faint of heart. I thanked her and walked to the back of the library, my mind racing. I had to find something, anything, that could explain what I had seen. I pulled dusty volumes off the shelves one by one, flipping through pages of old stories and local myths. The deeper I dug, the more uneasy I became. The water demon was real, at least in the minds of the people here. I found reference after reference, mentions of a creature, sometimes called a river spirit, other times a water wraith, that had haunted the area for centuries. The descriptions were vague at first, whispers of a shadowy figure seen late at night near the river, or a chilling voice carried on the wind. But as I kept reading, the details grew darker. There were stories of people who had gone missing near the water, their bodies never found, their fates a mystery. There were warnings, too, passed down from generation to generation: never go near the river after dark. Never make eye contact with the figure. Never. The warning struck a chord deep within me. I had broken all of those rules. I had gone near the river. I had looked into the eyes of the demon. I had felt it. I kept reading, searching for more specific details about this creature, trying to understand what it was, what it wanted, and, most importantly, how to escape it. But the more I learned, the more helpless I felt. Each account of the demon painted it as something ancient, something that had existed long before the town had been founded. Some stories claimed it was a spirit of vengeance, guarding the river, punishing those who dared to get too close. Others suggested it was an entity born from the very water itself, an immortal force tied to the flow of the river. But no matter what the stories said, they all agreed on one thing: the water demon could not be escaped. I spent hours poring over the books, trying to find some sort of clue, some scrap of information that could help me, but I found nothing that made me feel any safer. The more I read, the more trapped I felt. It was like the demon was everywhere, seeping into the very fabric of the town, into my thoughts, into my dreams. It was like it had always been there, waiting for me. I had to stop. The weight of the books, the stories, the warnings, they were too much. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. I looked around the room, feeling as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. I had to leave. But as I stood up, the librarian's voice stopped me. "You're not the first," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you won't be the last." I turned to her, confusion and dread mixing in my chest. "What do you mean?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. "The river has claimed many over the years. It takes what it wants, and it never lets go. If you've seen it, if it's touched you," she trailed off, her gaze distant, as if seeing something beyond me. "There's no running from it. No escaping it." The words echoed in my mind long after I left the library. I couldn't shake the feeling that the demon had been watching me the entire time, that it knew what I was doing, knew that I was looking for answers. The weight of its presence seemed to follow me, closer than ever. I felt it, lurking just beyond the reach of my senses, in the corners of the room, just outside the window. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't finished with me. Days passed in a blur of unease, each one stretching on endlessly, marked by small, unsettling signs that the demon's presence was far from over. I couldn't escape a feeling that something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just a lingering fear that haunted my thoughts, but the physical signs that I could no longer ignore. It began with the river. I had tried to avoid it after what had happened, tried to keep my distance from the place that had nearly consumed me. But there was an unexplainable pull, like the river itself was calling me, its voice distant yet unrelenting. I couldn't stay away for long. One morning, with my nerves frayed and my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't silence, I found myself walking toward it again. The air had a heaviness to it, thick and charged, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. I stood at the edge of the river, my feet rooted to the soft earth, staring at the water, watching as it flowed lazily, deceptively calm. But as I watched, I began to notice the subtle changes. The water, once clear and reflective, now looked murky, thick, almost as if it were hiding something beneath its surface. There was a strange, unnatural stillness to it, as if it had grown sluggish, reluctant to move as it once had. I leaned forward slightly, squinting, trying to make sense of the shift. For a moment, I thought I saw something beneath the surface, an indistinct shape shifting and slithering, like tendrils of shadow curling just out of sight. But when I blinked, it was gone, the water rippling gently as if nothing had happened. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a chill crawling down my spine. I stepped back, instinctively glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the demon to rise from the depths once more. But there was nothing. Just the water, silent and still. And then I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, a low murmur carried on the wind, barely audible. It sounded like the rustling of leaves, but it wasn't the wind, it was too rhythmic, too purposeful. The sound grew louder, the wind picking up, and with it came a strange, guttural growl, almost imperceptible, as if it was coming from deep within the earth itself. My heart raced, my breath catching in my throat. I could feel the weight of the sound, like a pressure pushing in on me from all sides. I turned back to the river, my eyes scanning the surface, my pulse thumping in my ears. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved beneath the surface, not just a shadow, but a figure, massive and long, like a serpent or some ancient creature. It was far below the surface, yet it felt as though it was moving toward me, closing the distance, its presence filling the air with an unnatural weight. The water around the shadow seemed to distort, bubbling and swirling as though disturbed by something large and powerful just beneath the surface. I stepped back again, my feet sinking into the soft mud, my mind racing. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the water, even as the chill in the air deepened, the temperature dropping sharply. A cold wind swept across the river, cutting through my clothes like a blade, and I shuddered. It wasn't just the wind. It felt like the wind itself was alive, alive with malice, with intent. The air around me seemed to vibrate with something unseen, something watching, waiting. The trees that lined the riverbank creaked in protest, their branches bending unnaturally in the gusts, as if they were reaching out toward the water or trying to escape it. And then, a sound unlike any I had ever heard before echoed across the river. It wasn't just a wind or a rustle, it was a voice. Low, guttural, and incomprehensible. It seemed to rise from the depths of the river, reverberating in my chest, shaking me to my core. Leave. The word was barely more than a whisper, but it carried weight, a cold command that seeped into my bones. I froze. My body refused to move, every instinct telling me to run, to escape, but my feet remained planted in place, as if the river had a hold on me, binding me to it. The sound faded, leaving only the howling wind behind, but its presence, remained, a suffocating pressure that made it difficult to breathe. My hands trembled, my stomach twisted into knots, and I wanted to scream, to get away, but I couldn't. The river, the demon, it was always there, pulling at me. I slowly turned, walking backward, keeping my eyes on the water, unable to look away from the shifting shadows beneath its surface. I was afraid that if I did, I would see it rise again, that it would reach out and drag me under. As I made my way back toward the cabin, the wind followed me, the cold cutting deeper, sharper, as if it were marking my every step. And in the distance, the sound of water moving against the shore, the whispering, the growling, echoed in my mind. I couldn't escape it. It was in the wind, in the water, in the very air I breathed. The demon was watching me, and I could feel its eyes on me even now. The day had been long, the unsettling presence of the river never far from my mind. I tried to distract myself, to go about my usual routine, but the weight of the water's call was inescapable. Every sound felt amplified, every whisper of wind felt like a warning. The shadows in the corners of my vision, I now knew, were not just tricks of the mind. They were real. I couldn't fight the feeling of dread any longer. I had to learn more. I had to understand what I was dealing with, even if that meant confronting the fear that had been clawing at me since I first saw the demon. It was then that I remembered the old man, Jacob Dunn. He was one of the few remaining elders in the town, a man whose family had lived here for generations. I had heard rumors over the years about his knowledge of the area's history, about the old stories that were passed down through the centuries. He was someone who might know more about the river's secrets, about the demon that haunted it. People in town spoke of him in hushed tones, almost as if they were afraid of him, afraid of what he knew. I found him at the edge of town, sitting on the porch of a weathered, old house that seemed to lean against the hill as though it was a part of the earth itself. His face was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of a life spent in the wilds of Missouri, but his eyes were sharp, filled with a knowing that made my skin crawl. "Jacob," I said cautiously, approaching him. "I need to talk to you. I've heard stories about the river, about what haunts it." He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, his gaze weighing me, measuring my resolve. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he motioned for me to sit beside him. "You've been to the river, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low, almost a growl. "Seen the figure?" I hesitated, but nodded. "I have." He sighed, the sound heavy, like a weight being dragged through mud. "You feel it, don't you? The pull, the fear. It gets in your bones. It doesn't let go." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "What is it? What is this thing?" Jacob's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not just a creature. It's a force. Something older than this land, older than the town, older than anything you can understand. It's the spirit of the river itself, but not in any way you'd expect. You can't reason with it. You can't run from it. And you sure as hell can't escape it." His words were like a punch to the gut, a confirmation of the fear that had been gnawing at me for days. But there was something more in his eyes, a knowledge, a warning. People have tried, you know, Jacob continued. They've tried to fight it, tried to leave, to flee. But the river won't let them. It chooses its victims. It knows what it wants. It knows you. It doesn't forget. I felt a chill creep down my spine, the wind picking up around us, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something older, fouler. I couldn't breathe for a moment. What happens to them? The ones who go missing. Jacob's lips tightened into a grim line. The river takes them. And it doesn't just take their bodies. It takes their souls too. It drags them down into the depths, twists their minds, leaves them changed. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. The wind howled as though in response to his words. There are stories of those who've gone into the water and returned, but they weren't the same. They're hollow, empty. They don't speak much, if at all. The demon's done its work on them. It's not just about the body, it's about the mind, the soul. It drags you down and leaves you with nothing but a shadow of who you were. Some say they never truly return. They become part of the river. It's in their blood, in their bones, in their eyes. And sometimes it wants to take more than just the body. It wants to make you like it, something other. I couldn't speak. I could feel the fear curling up in my chest, knotting itself into something raw and aching. I had felt it, hadn't I? The pull, the darkness that seemed to take hold of me, threatening to swallow me whole. You think you've seen it? You think you know what it is? You don't. Not yet, Jacob said, his voice dropping lower, a tremor of something old and dark threading through his words. That thing you saw in the water, it's not the full story. That's just the surface. The real terror, it's underneath. Waiting. I felt the blood drain from my face, the air thickening around me. Underneath? Jacob nodded, his face grim. You won't be able to outrun it. It knows your fear, and it thrives on it. And if it's taken hold of you, it won't let you go. Not ever. His words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating me, and I couldn't tell if he was warning me or sealing my fate with that final, unspoken truth. I don't know if you'll survive, Jacob added quietly, almost as an afterthought. But you'll never be the same. No one who's gone near that river has walked away untouched. I stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on me, suffocating me. As I left Jacob's porch, the sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the earth like fingers reaching out to pull me back. The wind was colder now, sharper, and it seemed to carry with it a voice, faint but unmistakable, leave. But I didn't know if I could. I didn't know if I wanted to. The river was calling, and the demon was waiting. The days that followed were a blur of unease and dread. The words Jacob had shared with me haunted my every waking moment. I couldn't shake them. The demon, the pull of the river, the terrifying knowledge that something ancient and dark was lurking beneath the surface, it was all consuming, twisting itself around my thoughts until I could think of nothing else. The town felt different now. I couldn't quite place it, but the people seemed distant, as if they too were avoiding something, some truth that they couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. I tried to talk to a few of them, but the conversations were stilted, awkward. It was as if they knew I was already in too deep, that there was no turning back. They no longer looked at me the same way. I felt their eyes on me, pity, fear, or something else, something I couldn't name, settling between us like a thick fog. I could no longer sleep, the hours slipping away in the darkness, my mind racing with thoughts of the river. Every night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the faint sounds of the wind in the trees outside making my skin crawl. The trees seemed to whisper in the wind now, the same unsettling growl I'd heard near the water, but this time it wasn't distant, it was here, close, suffocating. There was no escape from it. The river, the demon, it had become a part of me, and I couldn't seem to shake it. Even when I tried to focus on something else, a book, a meal, anything, it was there, always just under the surface, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. But worst of all was the calling. It started slowly at first, a faint, almost imperceptible sensation at the back of my mind, like a low hum that seemed to pulse from the river itself. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was a pull, an irresistible force that I couldn't explain. It was like the river was calling my name. Every time I walked past it, I felt it, like invisible hands reaching out to grasp me, urging me to come closer, to return. At first, I tried to ignore it, dismissing it as nothing more than my mind playing tricks on me. But as the days passed, the pull became stronger, more insistent, until it felt as though the river itself was wrapping around me, tightening its grip. I couldn't escape it. Every moment, every step, was leading me back to the river. One evening, when the sun had just dipped below the horizon, I found myself standing at the edge of the water again, though I couldn't remember how I got there. The darkness was thick now, creeping in from all sides, the air heavy and thick with the scent of damp earth. The wind was still, holding its breath. And then I heard it. The soft rustle, the barely audible whisper of something moving beneath the water's surface. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was the river itself, calling, urging me to come closer, to look deeper, to understand. I took a step forward, the ground soft beneath my boots, and the sound of the water seemed to grow louder, as though it were trying to draw me in. The river seemed to thrum with energy, an ancient power that radiated from it. It felt alive, like it was breathing, pulsing with something dark and hungry. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong. It was like the river was a part of me now, its current running through my veins, its voice echoing in my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, tightening with every breath. I felt like I was losing myself, like the boundaries between who I was and the river, between the world I had known and the world that was calling me, were starting to blur. "Come," the voice whispered, so faint it was almost imperceptible. But I heard it, felt it in the very marrow of my bones. It wasn't just a sound. It was a command, a compulsion I couldn't resist. The river was calling me to the depths. I stood there, frozen, my feet rooted to the earth, unable to move. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body didn't respond. The water churned before me, dark and endless, beckoning. It was then that I understood. The river wasn't just a body of water, it was a presence, a living thing, and it had been waiting for me. Waiting for this moment. I couldn't remember how long I stood there, caught between the river and my own fear. It was as if the world around me had vanished, leaving only the dark water, the eerie hum, and that pull, stronger than ever. And as I stood there, staring into the depths, I knew that this wasn't just my fear. This wasn't just my imagination. The river was alive, and it wanted me. The demon wanted me. The night air was thick with tension, heavy with the promise of something inevitable. The pull of the river was almost unbearable now, its presence like an invisible weight pressing on my chest, suffocating me. I stood at the water's edge, my feet sinking into the mud as I gazed into the black expanse before me. The sound of the river, the The whispering hum that had once unsettled me now felt like a call to destiny. I couldn't keep running from this. I couldn't keep pretending that the fear wasn't real, that it wasn't crawling beneath my skin, waiting for me to acknowledge it. The stories, the whispers in the wind, the shadows in the water, they were all connected, all part of the same terrible truth. I could feel it now in my bones. The demon wasn't just a myth, a story to frighten children. It was here. It was real. And it had been waiting for me. I had tried to ignore it, tried to rationalize it away, but the signs were too clear now. Every night, every moment I spent near this river, the demon was getting closer. The pull was stronger, more insistent. I had felt its power, its presence, but I had never truly seen it. I needed to know if it was real. I needed to understand what I was up against. The fear had festered long enough, and I could no longer let it control me. I was going to confront it, even if it meant walking straight into the heart of that darkness. Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer to the water. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, as if the earth itself was resisting my approach, but I didn't stop. The river rippled softly, the surface glimmering faintly in the moonlight. I felt it. It was waiting for me, watching, as though it knew exactly what I was about to do. With each step, I felt the weight of my decision pressing down on me. There was no turning back now. I couldn't just ignore this anymore. The river had a hold on me, and if I was going to survive this, I needed to face it head on. My heart raced as I knelt down at the water's edge, the chill of the night air seeping through my clothes. I looked into the river, my breath coming in shallow bursts. It seemed to stretch out endlessly, its depths hidden beneath layers of darkness. The faint sound of movement beneath the surface only heightened my fear, but it also filled me with something else, something primal. Curiosity. I reached out, my hand hovering just above the water, trembling. The current tugged at my fingertips, a coldness wrapping around my hand like a claw, pulling me deeper. I resisted the urge to pull back, forced myself to stay still, to focus. This was the moment. If I was going to confront this thing, I needed to see it. A soft ripple disturbed the water, followed by a shadow moving just beneath the surface. My heart skipped a beat. The figure, the demon, was there, lurking, waiting. Its presence sent a wave of terror through me, but also something else. It wasn't just fear, it was awe. A dark, terrible awe. It was real. I wasn't imagining this. It was here, in the river, watching me. I took a deep breath, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears. "Show yourself," I whispered, my voice shaky, but steady. "I'm not afraid of you. I need to know if you're real." The river responded, its surface shifting, rippling in patterns I couldn't quite understand. Then, as if responding to my challenge, a shape began to form beneath the water, growing more distinct with every passing second. It was the outline of a figure, dark and fluid, like a shadow rising from the depths. I could feel the power of it, the suffocating pressure of its presence, and yet there was something more. It was an ancient force, not of this world. It wasn't human, nor was it any kind of creature I could fathom. It was something born of the water itself, of dark, forgotten depths that should never have been touched. The figure emerged slowly, almost as if it was testing me, watching my every move. I could see now that it was humanoid in shape, but there was nothing human about it. Its form was distorted, its features a blur of shadows and liquid, as if it could shift and change at will. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark, endless voids that seemed to stare right through me, drawing me in, pulling me closer to the river. I could feel it, then, the full weight of its power. It was overwhelming, suffocating. The fear that had haunted me all this time was nothing compared to the reality of standing in the presence of this thing. It wasn't just watching me anymore, it was reaching into me, crawling through my thoughts, my memories. It was in me, and I couldn't escape it. I reached out again, my hand trembling, but this time I didn't pull away. This was my choice. I had to face it. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. The demon didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence spoke for it, louder than any words could. The river around me seemed to grow colder, the darkness deepening. The pull grew stronger, the currents twisting and pulling at my feet. I could feel the earth beneath me beginning to give way, the water rising higher, creeping over the ground like it was trying to consume me. But I stood my ground. I was here to confront it, to know what it truly was, and I wasn't going to back down. The shadowed figure began to move closer, its form stretching and shifting, like liquid shadows twisting into something more solid. A voice, deep and guttural, filled my mind. "You should not have come." It was a warning. But I couldn't turn back now. Not while I was finally facing the thing that had haunted my every thought, the thing that had twisted my world into something I didn't recognize. "I'm not afraid of you," I thought, but my heart was pounding, my hands shaking. The water demon was real. And I was about to find out just how real. The night air was thick with the weight of something unseen, heavy with the tension of what I knew I had to face. I had promised myself that I would confront the demon, that I would prove to myself that it was real, or maybe, I hoped, dispel the terrible feeling that had been growing inside me. But as I stood at the edge of the river again, I could feel it in my bones, the undeniable pull, like gravity itself was trying to drag me into the water. The moon was low, casting a faint, silvery glow across the rippling surface of the river. It was eerily still tonight, quieter than I had ever seen it. The usual sounds of the wind through the trees, the rustle of leaves, were absent, leaving only the soft, rhythmic sound of the water lapping against the shore. But even that sound, usually so soothing, felt wrong. It felt anticipatory. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe I thought the demon would be different this time, more solid, perhaps, or less terrifying. But now, standing here, I wasn't so sure. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around and leave. To run. But I couldn't. I couldn't let it win. Not after everything I'd experienced, everything I'd heard. I stepped closer to the water, my feet sinking into the soft, wet earth. A chill ran down my spine, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The river stretched out before me, dark and endless, as though it could swallow me whole. The pull was stronger now, as though the river itself were breathing, drawing me in. I could almost feel the weight of something heavy, something ancient and powerful, pressing down on me from beneath the surface. It was then that I felt it, a sharp, stabbing sensation, like icy fingers wrapping around my chest, squeezing. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The air felt thicker, denser. The danger wasn't just an unsettling feeling anymore, it was real. The shadows along the water's edge seemed to deepen, creeping closer, like the night itself was reaching out to trap me. The river, usually calm, was now unnaturally still, the water barely moving, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. I heard it then, faint at first, but growing louder. A low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. The sound wasn't coming from the wind or the trees. It was coming from the water itself. It was the same hum I had heard before, the one that had made my skin crawl and my heart race, only this time it was much stronger, more real, more powerful. I took another step closer, despite the terror threatening to paralyze me. The feeling of something watching me was overwhelming now. My eyes darted nervously around the riverbank, scanning the dark silhouettes of trees and the thick shadows that clung to the ground. I couldn't see anything, but I knew it was there. I felt it. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, but it was wrong. It wasn't the usual whisper of the forest. This wind felt cold, biting, as if it carried something with it, something alive. I gasped, my heart leaping into my throat as I felt the unmistakable sensation of something brushing past me, just out of sight. My pulse quickened, my breath coming faster. I tried to steady myself, to calm my racing thoughts. It's just the wind. It's just the river playing tricks on you. But I couldn't deny the sense of danger that was growing with every second, every breath. Then, as if on cue, the water shifted. A ripple ran through the surface, followed by another, then a series of sharp movements that sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my feet locked in place, my heart pounding harder now, like it was trying to escape my chest. I knew it. I knew this was it. The shadows in the water began to take shape, swirling and stretching, forming into something dark, something alive. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the figure rising from the depths. It was indistinct at first, but then it solidified, and I saw it. The demon. The figure was tall, towering over the water, its form made of shifting shadows and rippling water, like it was made of the very river itself. It had no face, no recognizable features, just an overwhelming, shifting mass of darkness. Its presence was suffocating, its form radiating an ancient, untamable power. The water around it seemed to churn and twist, as if responding to its will. I felt my body lock up, every muscle seizing, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. The river's pull was stronger now, urging me closer, and I could feel my own fear rising, fighting against the compulsion. My feet felt like they were glued to the earth, unable to move, as though the demon had already wrapped its invisible claws around me, rooting me in place. The wind howled again, but this time it wasn't just the wind. It was the sound of something far deeper, something ancient, a cry that seemed to come from the river itself. The water churned violently, and I thought I saw something, a flash of movement beneath the surface, something large moving quickly beneath the ripples, circling, watching. It was real. This thing was real. The demon's presence was like a weight pressing on my chest, suffocating, oppressive. It wasn't just a creature. It was a force of nature. And it wanted me. I took a step back, my heart racing, but something inside me refused to turn away. I couldn't. This was the moment. I had come to face it, to understand it, and now that it was here, I had to find a way to survive it. But in that moment, as the demon's shadow loomed closer, a thought crossed my mind. Was there even a way to survive this at all? I didn't know. All I knew was that I was here. And I wasn't leaving without a fight. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the landscape draped in an eerie twilight. The once familiar river now seemed alien, its waters deepened into an ink-black void that stretched far beyond the reach of the fading light. Shadows clung to the trees along the banks, long and twisted, as if the very darkness had come alive, creeping toward me, urging me to turn back. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I stood at the edge, barely able to breathe, my body trembling as the figure on the water began to take shape. At first, it had been nothing more than a shadow, a flicker on the surface of the river, a trick of the light, perhaps, or the wind. But now, as the last remnants of daylight were swallowed by the night, the figure grew clearer, more solid, until it was impossible to deny what I was seeing. It was massive, towering above the water, its shape shifting and swirling in a way that defied logic. The form appeared to be made entirely of darkness, yet it rippled with the same fluidity as the water itself. It was as if the river had birthed it, sculpted it from the depths, and now it stood before me, its form both terrifying and mesmerizing. I could feel it. It knew I was here. The air around me seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping sharply. A cold, biting chill swept across the water, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I glanced around the riverbank, feeling as though the very earth beneath my feet was shifting, the ground trembling slightly with each pulse of the demon's power. But there was nowhere to hide, no safe place. It was just me and the thing that had haunted my every thought. The demon's form became more defined now, its outline sharper as the moonlight crept higher in the sky. I could see it more clearly, an enormous, humanoid shape, though its proportions were warped, exaggerated, unnatural. It had long, elongated limbs, twisted and gnarled like the roots of an ancient tree, covered in what looked like waterlogged skin, slick and dark as if it had crawled from the deepest, most forgotten parts of the river. Its torso was massive, its chest rising and falling with a slow, rhythmic motion, like the flow of the river itself. Its face was what struck me the most. Or, rather, the lack of one. It had no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just an endless void, a blackened expanse that seemed to consume the surrounding light. I felt it drawing me in, pulling me closer with every passing second, as if the darkness itself had a weight to it, something I could not escape. A strange noise, a low, rumbling hum, began to emanate from the demon. It wasn't a voice, at least not in any way I could comprehend. It was more like the river itself had begun to speak, its currents becoming words, its ripples forming sounds that pressed into my mind. The sensation was unnerving, as if the very essence of the water was trying to invade my thoughts, twisting my senses and breaking apart my understanding of reality. I stepped back involuntarily, my breath coming in sharp gasps. My heart raced, hammering in my chest, as I struggled to keep my feet grounded. I had wanted this moment, hadn't I? I had come here to confront the demon, to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid. But now that it was standing before me, its presence so overwhelming, so real, I felt the fear coursing through my veins like ice. The wind began to pick up again, but it wasn't the same as before. This wind was cold, biting, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of something ancient, something decayed. The leaves rustled on the trees, but their movements were erratic, as if the very forest itself was uneasy, disturbed by the power that now radiated from the figure in the water. The demon's head shifted slowly, tilting to one side, as if studying me. There was no expression, no change in its faceless visage, but somehow I could feel its gaze, a force that pushed against my will, scraping at the edges of my mind, testing me. I felt myself standing frozen in place, my body no longer obeying my commands, as if the river's pull was slowly taking control of me. The figure stretched then, its limbs elongating further, its body twisting unnaturally, as though it could change form at will. The water around it seemed to churn and bubble, its surface writhing like a living thing, reacting to the demon's movements. My eyes couldn't track it fast enough. Every time I thought I saw its full shape, it shifted again, always changing, always threatening to consume me with its malice. I couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. The river had become its prison, and I was trapped on the edge, unable to retreat. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat thick with fear. I had hoped that by confronting it, I would find some way to understand it, to control it. But this creature, this thing, was beyond any understanding. It was primal, older than the river itself, a force that should not exist in this world. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't meant to fight this. I wasn't meant to win. A horrible thought began to creep into my mind as the demon's shifting form grew closer to the edge of the water, its movements slow but deliberate. The pull was stronger now, more insistent. And I realized this was not a confrontation. This was an invitation. The demon wasn't here to fight me. It was here to claim me. My heart skipped a beat. The realization was terrifying, but there was a clarity in it, too. There was no escaping it now. The river had called me, and it would have its due. The demon was not just a force of nature, it was a creature bound to the water, a part of the river itself, and it was patient. It would wait for me. And now, it had no reason to wait any longer. As the figure began to rise from the water fully, I knew that my fate was sealed. I couldn't breathe. Every inch of my body felt paralyzed, as though my very existence was being drawn into the demon's presence. The world around me had shrunk, narrowing to the figure rising from the river. My limbs felt like they were made of stone, unyielding and heavy. I couldn't move, couldn't even lift a finger. I was trapped, frozen in place by something far beyond my control. The demon's slow, deliberate movements seemed to stretch time itself. Each step it took, its shadow grew longer, darker, reaching across the water, wrapping around me like an inescapable noose. The air thickened, pressing down on me from all sides, suffocating me with its unnatural weight. The river's ripples had slowed, becoming deeper, darker, like the breath of something ancient, waiting. And then, I saw it, its eyes. At first, I had only seen its form, imposing, dark, a shapeless void. But now, as it drew closer, I could make out two faint glows piercing through the blackness of its face. The light wasn't natural, it was the pale, sickly green of decay, the color of something dead yet unyielding, like the faint glow of algae beneath the surface of stagnant water. They were eyes that bore into me with a chilling intensity, eyes that made the very ground beneath my feet tremble. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break free from this nightmare, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey. My muscles were locked, my lungs frozen in mid-breath. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat sounding like a drum in my ears, but my body wouldn't react. The demon's gaze held me in place, each pulse of its glowing eyes sinking deeper into my soul, stripping away my will to fight. It was as if the demon could see everything, every fear I had ever hidden, every doubt, every secret I buried. Its gaze was not just physical, it was penetrating, reaching into the very core of me, pulling at everything I tried to keep buried. The weight of its stare pressed against my chest, like the water itself had climbed out of the river and was slowly suffocating me. I felt my breath hitch as the demon closed the distance between us. Its long, gnarled arms reached forward, its fingers stretching toward me with an unnerving, deliberate slowness, each movement measured and controlled. The air around us grew colder, the wind picking up as if something was stirring beneath the water, something vast and hungry. The moonlight reflected off the surface of the river, illuminating the demon's form in sharp relief, casting strange, elongated shadows that danced across the ground like creatures of the dark. I wanted to look away, to break free from its gaze, but I couldn't. Its eyes held me captive, unblinking, unfeeling. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to survive, but my body remained a prisoner, frozen by fear, by the power that radiated from this creature. It wasn't just fear. It was terror. It was the primal, gut-wrenching realization that I was utterly powerless in the face of something ancient and unstoppable. This wasn't just a creature from the river, it was the river. It was the embodiment of all the things I had feared. The unknown, the relentless force of nature, the cold, uncaring force that could swallow me whole without a second thought. I felt the air grow colder still as the demon's fingers inched closer. They were long and twisted, like the roots of some ancient, forgotten tree, slick with the same dark water that seemed to flow through its veins. The tips of its fingers brushed against the edge of the river, sending ripples out into the water. I could feel the current of those ripples deep in my bones, tugging at me, pulling me toward the depths. My mind screamed, "Move! Move!" But nothing happened. The demon's mouth, if it could be called that, twitched as though it was about to speak, but no words came. Only that low, rumbling hum. It echoed through the air, vibrating deep in my chest. I could feel it, reverberating in my bones, in my very soul. It wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking through me, through everything I had ever known. The closer it came, the more I could feel its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. Its form, though still made of shifting shadows, was becoming more tangible. The closer it got, the more real it felt. The water around it surged violently, waves crashing against the shore, but it did not falter. The figure seemed to glide effortlessly across the surface of the river, no longer bound by the limitations of nature. It was something more than that now. The demon was no longer just an entity. It was a force, a predator, and I was its prey. As it loomed over me, the glow from its eyes intensified, cutting through the darkness like twin lanterns guiding me toward my end. I could feel it, the inevitability of it, the knowledge that there was no escape, no salvation, no fight left in me. And still, I couldn't move. I was trapped in the demon's gaze, waiting for the moment when its fingers would touch me, when it would drag me into the water, when the river would claim me as it had so many others before me. But in that frozen moment, when I knew that I had no power, no way to escape, I heard something else, something more terrifying than the demon's hum. It was a voice. Soft at first, a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere, yet somehow everywhere. "You belong to me." And in that moment, I knew it was too late. I couldn't breathe. The words the demon spoke echoed in my mind, a chilling declaration that shook me to my core. "You belong to me." And in that moment, I realized that there was no escape, no chance of survival. But my instincts, my primal need to survive, kicked in. I couldn't stand there, frozen forever. I couldn't let the river pull me under, couldn't let the demon claim me without a fight. My body, which had been paralyzed by terror only moments before, surged to life, the flood of adrenaline breaking through the icy grip of fear. I had to run. I had to get away. I turned sharply, my heart hammering in my chest, and took my first step toward the trees, toward the safety of the forest. My legs felt heavy, unsteady, like they were moving through thick mud, but I pushed forward, my eyes fixed on the dark silhouettes of the trees just beyond the riverbank. I heard the water behind me, the demon's presence growing stronger with every step I took, but I didn't dare look back. Just keep running. Just keep running. But no matter how fast I moved, the ground felt wrong. The air grew colder, heavier, the pressure around me thickening. I could hear the soft splashes of the river, the sloshing of something moving just beneath the surface, and the noise grew louder, closer. It was as though the river itself had become an extension of the demon, a tool to trap me. I glanced over my shoulder. And there it was, the water had begun to rise. Not just the surface of the river, but the very air seemed to shift with it. The water curled and swirled, pulling itself upward like an invisible hand, its surface rippling in unnatural patterns. The demon, a shadow on the water, was no longer just an entity hovering at the edge of the river. It was a force, and the river was its weapon. The ground beneath me trembled, as though the earth itself was shaking in response to the power now coursing through the water. My heart raced as the panic surged inside me, pushing my feet harder, faster. I stumbled, but I didn't stop. I reached the edge of the trees. I was almost there. The thick, dark trunks were within reach. I could hide. I could run deeper into the forest. But just as I thought I might make it, it happened. The river seemed to explode around me. I heard the crash of water, the violent splash as if the river itself had been thrown into the air. And then, in an instant, the ground beneath me gave way. My foot sank into the soft mud at the river's edge, and before I could pull it out, I felt a cold, grasping force wrap around my ankle. I gasped, my heart racing as I tried to yank my foot free, but it was useless. The water had reached me. It surged, rising up around my leg, wrapping around my foot like a vice, holding me in place. I looked down in horror. The water was no longer just water. It was alive. The river had become a trap, its current twisted and malicious, pulling at me with unnatural strength. I tugged at my foot again, but the more I struggled, the harder it became to move. It was like trying to break free from a vice, and the harder I fought, the tighter the water's grip became. The demon's presence loomed behind me, its dark form shifting with the rising waves. I could feel its gaze even without looking, cold, penetrating, like it was watching me from within the water itself. My breath hitched as the pressure around my ankle tightened, dragging me closer to the water's edge. My body lurched with panic, and my hands shot out to grab anything, any tree branch, any rock, to stop myself from being dragged into the river. But there was nothing. The demon had taken control. The river was no longer just a river, it was an extension of its will, a force beyond my understanding. It bent to its every whim, trapping me, holding me in place like a fly caught in a spider's web. I looked around, my eyes wild with fear, desperate for anything that might help. I could feel the cold, wet earth around me, the air growing heavier, suffocating with the demon's power. The water continued to pull at me, dragging me closer to the river's depths. In the distance, I saw the demon's form shift again, its glowing eyes flickering like distant stars. It didn't need to speak to me anymore. I could feel it, it had me. The water, the darkness, the air, they were all its servants now, working together to ensure I didn't escape. I was stuck. There was nowhere to go. The river was no longer just a body of water, it was a living, breathing thing, a monster in its own right, and I had become a part of it. My legs trembled, the terror inside me threatening to break free, but my body was locked in place. There was no way out. There was no escape. I felt the water rise higher, reaching my knee, then my waist, then, no! I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night, consumed by the very river that was claiming me. And still, the demon's eyes watched, glowing with malice. You belong to me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The grip of the water around my ankle was tight, like the cold, unrelenting fingers of something alive, something ancient. But the water wasn't what held me there. It was the demon's voice. The whispers. They crept into my mind like a slow, invasive poison, threading through my thoughts with malicious intent. I tried to block them out, tried to focus on something, anything else, but the voice only grew louder, clearer, more insistent. You're weak. You've always been weak. The words slid through my mind like shadows, turning everything I had ever believed about myself into dust. The water was rising around me, colder now, darker, pulling me deeper into the river's depths with each passing second. But it wasn't the water I feared anymore. No, it was the voice that knew every part of me, every failure, every fear. You'll never escape this. You'll never escape me. I wanted to scream, to fight back. But my throat was dry. My mind was unraveling, every thought slipping into a tangled mess. The water, the whispers, they weren't just physical. They were in my head, making me see things, making me feel things that weren't real. Or were they? Remember your past? Remember your failures? The people you abandoned? The promises you broke? The memories came flooding back in a rush, dark, twisted images of things I had buried long ago. Faces from my past, their eyes filled with disappointment. The people I had hurt, the things I had done and never made right. The guilt, the shame, they all surfaced like ghosts, clawing at my mind. The demon's voice grew stronger, like a roar beneath a whisper. You thought you could escape? You thought you could outrun your past? You are mine now. All of you. My chest tightened. My heart hammered painfully in my ribs. The ground beneath me shifted, and the air around me thickened, pressing down like a weight I couldn't escape. The darkness of the river seemed to grow, swallowing everything around me, and I couldn't tell where the water ended and the air began. It was all one. It was all the same. I looked down at the water, at the cold fingers of it gripping my leg, pulling me further into the abyss. I could feel it. I could feel the river inside me, its chill seeping into my bones, mixing with my fear, turning my insides to ice. The whispers were relentless, biting into my thoughts, tearing at the walls I had built around myself. Do you hear that? The sound of your heartbeat? It's the sound of your inevitable end. I wanted to stop it. To stop everything. But the more I fought, the more the water rose, the more the demon's voice wrapped around me, tightening like a noose. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was as though the very essence of my being was being pulled into the river, into the darkness, into whatever thing the demon had become. It wasn't just a creature, it was everything. It was the water, the air, the land. It was the reflection of all my deepest, darkest thoughts, all the things I feared most. It was the weight of my regrets, the weight of my sins, and now it was going to take me. You're nothing. You'll never be anything. This is where it ends. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't breathe. I felt as though I was drowning, but not in the river. No, I was drowning in my own mind, in the suffocating, oppressive weight of everything I had ever tried to forget. The whispers cut through me like knives, ripping at my sanity, forcing me to face all the dark corners of my soul that I had spent my life avoiding. The water rose higher, swallowing me inch by inch, and I felt it, the demon, inside me now. Its voice, its presence, everything I had ever feared, it was all becoming part of me. The boundaries between the demon and myself were dissolving, and I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. I could feel my mind breaking, cracking under the weight of the pressure. The whispers were no longer just words. They were visions, flashes of my deepest fears playing out before my eyes. I saw myself failing. I saw my loved ones, my friends, all of them turning away from me, disgusted by the person I had become. I saw myself alone, drowning, forgotten. The fear was unbearable. My mind was spiraling, and I could no longer hold on to anything. The more I fought to cling to reality, the more it slipped through my fingers like water. I could feel the river pulling me deeper now, dragging me into the cold, black void beneath. You cannot escape me. You cannot escape yourself. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but my voice was gone. The words couldn't escape. The terror paralyzed me from the inside out. The whispers filled every inch of my mind, every inch of my soul. I had become part of the river, part of the demon. There was no separation. It had consumed me. And then, in the darkest part of my mind, I realized the horrifying truth. This was never just about the river, about the demon. It was about me. My fear. My guilt. My darkness. The demon was not just something out there. It had always been inside me. The water, the whispers, the terror, they were just mirrors, reflections of everything I had tried to bury. There was no escape. I was lost. And the demon had won. I don't know how long I was there, trapped, suffocating under the weight of my own fear, drowning in the dark whispers that tore at my mind. The water had risen to my waist now, cold as ice, and still, the demon's grip held me in place. It had been relentless, feeding on my terror, feeding on my weakness, drawing me deeper into its grasp with every passing second. But something inside me, something deep inside me, refused to let go. I can't die here. Not like this. The thought rang out like a battle cry in my mind, cutting through the fog of terror that had clouded my senses. I had to fight. I had to break free. I couldn't let it end like this, couldn't let the river take me, couldn't let the demon consume me whole. I gathered every ounce of strength I had left, even though my body felt like it was made of stone, my limbs weak and trembling under the strain of the cold water. My hands gripped the muddy earth beneath me, my nails digging into the soil as if I could anchor myself to something, anything, to stop the river from pulling me under. The whispers in my mind grew louder, sharper, more demanding. You are mine. You belong to me. But this time, the voice didn't scare me. It only fueled the fire that was beginning to burn inside me. I wasn't its prisoner. I wasn't the demon's plaything. I wasn't going to let it define me, consume me, drown me. I pushed harder against the water, my legs straining, my muscles burning with the effort. The demon's presence pressed down on me from all sides, but the desire to survive, a primal, raw need to escape, was stronger than the weight of my fear. You cannot fight me. You cannot escape this. The water rose higher, but I didn't stop. I clenched my fists, my eyes shut tight, forcing myself to ignore the gnawing sensation that I was slipping deeper into darkness, deeper into the river's cold embrace. The demon's power was vast, overwhelming, but I was determined to break free. I had to. With a violent jerk, I pulled my foot from the river's grip, my body jerking as the water tugged at me. I stumbled, nearly falling, but I refused to go down. My heart pounded in my chest, my blood thundering in my ears as I fought the terror that was now clawing at me from the inside. The whispers had changed. They weren't taunting anymore. They were pleading. You can't do this. It's too late. You will drown. You will fall. But the harder I fought, the weaker the voice became. The river's pull wasn't as strong now. I could feel the demon's influence beginning to wane, like a storm that was slowly losing its strength. The darkness, the fear, the cold, it was all slipping away, piece by piece. I could do this. I could break free. With a final, desperate push, I wrenched myself free from the river's grasp. The water resisted, thrashing around me like a living thing, but I fought with everything I had left. My legs burned, my chest ached from the exertion, but I didn't care. The river was losing its hold, and I was winning. I stumbled backward, slipping on the muddy bank, but I didn't stop. I pushed myself to my feet, stumbling away from the water, away from the demon that had almost claimed me. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I was free. The water churned behind me, the river surging as though angry at my escape, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I was still fighting the fear that clung to my skin, the cold that lingered in my bones, but I was out. I was alive. I looked toward the forest again, toward the darkness that loomed just beyond the riverbank, the trees standing silent and watchful. The demon was still out there, I knew that. But I had taken the first step. I had fought back, and that was enough for now. I had survived. But I knew the battle wasn't over. I staggered away from the riverbank, my feet sinking into the wet soil as the cold air bit at my skin. I couldn't look back. Not yet. My heart was still racing, the adrenaline from the struggle pumping through my veins like fire. I had escaped. For now, at least. But something wasn't right. The air had shifted. The silence that surrounded me wasn't natural. The wind had stopped, and the sounds of the night, chirping insects, the rustle of leaves in the trees, had all but vanished. The world felt still, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for me to make a mistake. I glanced back at the river, my eyes drawn to the churning water, the darkness swirling like an unholy force. It looked different now. The water was darker than before, almost too dark, as though it had absorbed the very shadows around it. It moved in unnatural patterns, twisting in violent spirals. No. I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the thoughts creeping back into my mind. But it was impossible. The river, the demon, was still there, still waiting. I had fought for my life. But now, I realized I wasn't just fighting for survival. I was fighting for my very mind. The whispers were there again, lurking in the back of my thoughts. Faint at first, like a distant hum, but growing louder with each passing second. The river was calling me, its voice like the wind that howls through a haunted house, beckoning me back into its depths. And as much as I tried to push it away, as much as I tried to keep my feet planted firmly on the earth, the pull of it, the pull of the demon, was growing stronger. You can't escape me. I gritted my teeth, pressing my hands to my temples as if I could physically block the sound out. But it was no use. The whispers seeped in, slithering through the cracks in my mind, twisting my thoughts, distorting everything I knew. You think you've escaped? You think you've won? The ground beneath me shifted, the earth feeling like it was giving way. The trees in the distance bent unnaturally, their trunks warping, their leaves rustling without wind. I wasn't just hearing the river anymore. I wasn't just seeing the demon's figure on the water. It was inside me. Its influence was slipping into my mind, into my very thoughts, and I could feel it wrapping around me like a noose. This is your fault. This is all your fault. I stumbled backward, the world blurring around me as the water's pull grew stronger, as though the river itself had come alive. The demon's presence, no, its mind, was everywhere, filling every crack in my reality. I was no longer sure where the demon ended and I began. You see me. You know what I can do. You cannot escape this. The whispers weren't just words anymore. They were images, flashes of horrible things, grotesque and suffocating. Faces of people I loved, now twisted in fear, staring at me with hollow eyes. The guilt that I had buried deep inside me, it was coming to the surface now, flooding my mind in a tidal wave. You deserve this. You always have. I fought against it. I tried to breathe through the suffocating panic that gripped my chest. But it wasn't enough. I could feel the ground beneath me shifting, the soil growing soft, giving way to the river's encroaching grip. The water seemed to pulse, as if the river itself had become a living, breathing thing, feeding on my fear, feeding on my weakness. I wasn't just fighting for my life anymore. I was fighting for control. For my sanity. The weight of the fear was unbearable. The demon knew my every thought, every fear, every weakness. It was inside me, twisting my mind, pulling me further from reality. I wanted to run, to flee, but the moment I took a step, the demon's grip on the earth tightened, the shadows deepened, and the world seemed to close in on me. You can't escape yourself. I shut my eyes, pushing against the darkness that threatened to consume me. I focused on the cold air, on the ground beneath my feet. I forced myself to remember who I was, to remember that I wasn't the demon. I was me. I had to fight that darkness inside me. But the longer I stood there, the harder it became. My thoughts were fraying at the edges, unraveling. The whispers in my head grew louder, more insistent. I could almost hear the demon laughing, deep and hollow, like an echo from the depths of hell. I had escaped the water, but I wasn't free. I was trapped in my own mind. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. The world around me felt as if it were closing in, the shadows growing deeper, darker. The whispers of the demon were all I could hear, a cacophony of malice that buzzed like a swarm of bees in my mind. It was relentless. The fear it twisted in my chest was suffocating, but I refused to let it crush me. I had to fight back. I stumbled backward, my hands outstretched, trying to steady myself as my legs threatened to give way. The demon's presence was overwhelming, wrapping itself around me like a thick, suffocating fog. I could feel the weight of its influence pressing down on my every thought, every action. But amid the darkness, a single, fragile thought emerged, a thought I hadn't let myself entertain before. Maybe there's a way to make it stop. I forced myself to breathe deeply, struggling to block out the suffocating noise in my head. The river churned behind me, its pulse still there, but for a moment, I stood still. I didn't know why. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was desperation. But there was something about the demon's presence that seemed off. It wasn't just anger or hatred. There was something else, a hunger, yes, but also something deeper. Something I could use. I looked out at the water, watching the shadows on its surface. They swirled and writhed, like serpents coiling around each other. I took a shaky step forward, the ground soft beneath my feet. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat gathering on my brow. But I had to do this. I had to try. What do you want from me? I shouted, the words almost getting lost in the roar of the river. My voice trembled, but I pushed on. Why are you doing this? Why are you here? The river remained silent for a moment, as if the demon was considering my words. The water stilled, and the chilling whispers seemed to recede just for a second. But then, a voice, deep, resonant, and full of ancient malice, slithered through the air, brushing against the edges of my consciousness. You cannot understand what I am. You cannot understand what you have awoken. I took another step forward, my mind racing. What do I say to this thing? But the words kept coming, as if my desperation was giving me strength I hadn't known I had. I don't care what you are. I yelled, my voice trembling, but defiant. I won't let you control me. I won't let you win. The water rippled again, as if it were reacting to my words, the dark shadows pulling back just slightly. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something small, but real. Hope. The demon's grip on me wasn't as strong as before. You cannot fight me forever. The voice was no longer as certain. There was a hint of uncertainty in its words. I have always been here. You cannot escape. But I didn't stop. I pushed against the feeling of cold despair that crept at the edges of my mind. I know you've been here, but I'm not like the others. You can't make me like them. I shouted. The water seemed to pause again, as if waiting for my next move. I could feel the demon shifting, its thoughts wrapping around mine, but the desperation in my chest kept me focused. You think I'm afraid? You think I'm just going to give up? There was silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. I held my breath, waiting. Then, the demon's voice spoke again, but this time it sounded different. Weaker. The power it had over me seemed to be slipping, just for a moment. You are strong, mortal. Stronger than I expected. The words were chilling, but they didn't feel as final as before. I felt something in my chest stir, a fragment of strength, a shard of defiance that I hadn't felt before. It wasn't just fear that I was fighting now, it was will. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of control. The demon's grip on me was loosening. I will fight you, I whispered, my voice now steady despite the terror clawing at my insides. I will not let you have me. The water churned violently, the ripples snapping in the air like the lash of a whip. But as I stood there, grounded in my words, I felt something shift. The whispers, the darkness, the weight of its power, it wasn't as suffocating anymore. The fear, though still there, didn't have the same hold on me. The demon's voice grew quieter, more distant. You are not the first to challenge me. You will not be the last. But your defiance. The voice seemed almost curious now, as if studying me. It amuses me. It makes this game interesting. For the briefest moment, I felt something else, something human, a sliver of my own power, my own agency, fighting back. I didn't know how long it would last, or if I could hold on, but in that fleeting moment, the demon wasn't invincible. It wasn't all-powerful. And maybe, just maybe, I still had a chance. The demon's voice hung in the air, thick with malice, but as I stood there, a strange calm began to wash over me. The whispers were still there, but they felt quieter now, distant, almost like they were struggling to reach me through a fog. My thoughts, however fractured and scattered, seemed to slow down, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a moment of clarity. I stared at the river, my chest heaving as I fought to control my breathing, my mind grasping at anything that might help me escape. And then, like a fleeting image in a dream, a memory from the local legend surfaced, cutting through the chaos in my mind. The elders had spoken of the water demon in hushed voices. Some called it a protector, a guardian of the river, while others feared it as a malevolent force, a creature that fed on the souls of those who dared to trespass too close. But there was one detail, one crucial piece of the legend that stood out to me now. The river demon could only be stopped by an offering made at the water's edge during the moment of its greatest strength. The words echoed in my mind, and I felt a pang of hope. There was a way. The elders spoke of an ancient ritual, an offering that could break the demon's hold over the water, one that required an item with personal meaning, something precious. It wasn't much, but in my desperation, it felt like the only chance I had left. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to remember the specifics. The legend spoke of a gift, something that would connect the person with the river in a way that was both binding and freeing. The offering had to be given willingly, with the intention of surrendering something personal to the water. A part of the self. The exact details had always been a mystery to me, too many versions of the tale, too many interpretations, but the core of it was clear. The demon could be tricked. It could be momentarily bound if the offering was accepted. I opened my eyes, glancing at the water, its surface shimmering in the faint moonlight. My heart thudded in my chest, and I could feel the demon's presence lurking just beneath the surface, like a hungry animal waiting for the right moment to strike. But the idea that had formed in my mind, however desperate, however risky, was my only chance. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small trinket I had carried with me for years, an old silver coin. It wasn't much. In fact, it had once belonged to my grandfather, a small memento of the family I had left behind. I had carried it out of sentimentality, never really understanding its true significance, until now. I could feel the weight of it in my hand, the cool metal smooth against my skin. The coin was simple, but it represented everything that I held dear, my past, my family, my life before the terror that had overtaken me. Could this be the offering the legend spoke of? Could this be the way to trick the demon, to sever its hold on me? I didn't know, but I couldn't wait any longer. You want my fear? I muttered, gripping the coin tightly in my hand. You want my soul? I felt the demon's presence rise again, dark and oppressive, like the heavy weight of an ocean about to crash over me. But I didn't look away. This was my chance. Take this, I whispered, holding the coin out over the river, and leave me in peace. For a moment, nothing happened. The water remained still, the air heavy with tension. My heart pounded in my chest as I held my breath, waiting for the demon's response. And then, a change. The air shifted, the whispering voices fading to a faint murmur. The water rippled beneath the moonlight, the surface breaking apart in a slow, deliberate movement. The demon was still there, but it seemed uncertain. It was as if the offering, the gesture, had interrupted its control, causing it to hesitate. I felt a chill wrap around me, but it wasn't just the cold of the night. It was the presence of the demon, wavering for the first time since I had encountered it. You think this will stop me? The voice hissed, sharper now, like nails scraping against stone. This is only temporary. I am eternal. I swallowed hard, but I didn't back down. I knew it wasn't over. I knew the demon would never be easily defeated. But in that brief, fragile moment, I had some control. The offering had momentarily distracted the demon, perhaps even weakened it. And that was enough. You're not eternal, I whispered, more to myself than to the demon. Not if I can stop you. I knew this wasn't the end. The demon would return. But for the first time, I felt the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, I could win this battle. The coin had worked. The legend had been real. But would it be enough to stop the demon forever? That, I didn't know. But in that moment, I had something I hadn't had before, a weapon. A weapon that came from understanding. A weapon that would make the demon question its own power. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that I might just survive this. The river was still, but the air felt charged, heavy with the anticipation of what was about to come. The demon's presence, once an overwhelming force, now pulsed like an invisible wave, slowly but steadily closing in on me. It had been a momentary victory, the offering, the coin, the brief flicker of hope, but I knew it wasn't enough. The demon wasn't going to be fooled for long. I could feel it in my bones, the weight of the battle ahead. I could feel the demon's fury simmering beneath the surface, ready to explode. And I knew, deep down, that only one of us was going to walk away from this. Either I would survive, or it would be over. I stood at the edge of the river, staring down at the black, swirling water. The moonlight barely broke through the thick clouds, casting a pale glow across the landscape, but the shadows seemed to deepen, almost as if the demon was gathering them around itself. The water lapped gently against the shore, but there was something wrong about it, the way it seemed to curl, twisting unnaturally, like the river itself was alive. The whispers had returned. Low at first, then building in volume until they drowned out everything else. I could hear my name, my fears, my deepest doubts. It was taunting me, trying to break me down. I gripped the coin in my pocket, the cold metal grounding me in reality. This was my last chance. There was no turning back now. If I didn't act decisively, the demon would consume me, mind and soul. I stepped forward, my feet sinking slightly into the soft earth. Every instinct screamed for me to run, to flee from the power I could feel in the water, but I stood my ground. I wasn't going to let it win. "You've had your fun," I muttered, my voice shaky but resolute. "But I'm done being afraid of you." The water began to stir violently. The surface broke open in jagged, dark waves, and the demon's form emerged, rising like a monstrous serpent from the depths. Its eyes, those glowing eyes, fixed on me, burning with an unholy fury. Its presence was suffocating, a cold that reached into my bones, but I refused to look away. I had faced it once before, and I was still standing. "You think you can defeat me?" The demon's voice slid through the air, mocking and dangerous. "You are nothing. You are weak. You cannot survive this." I felt the fear creeping back into my chest, squeezing at my heart, but I forced it down. This time, I knew what I had to do. I had already made the offering. Now, I had to take the final step. I reached into my jacket pocket, my fingers brushing against the coin. The demon roared, its form writhing, as if enraged by the defiance in my stance. I could feel the pull of the river, its force trying to drag me in, to drown me in its depths, but I wouldn't let it. I raised the coin high above my head, my arm trembling, and I spoke the words that had been passed down in the legends, the words I hoped would be enough to break the demon's hold. "I offer you this, my past, my fear, my defiance. Take it and leave me be." The demon screeched in fury, its form collapsing in on itself, shifting and twisting like smoke. It was trying to fight back, to resist the offering, but it was too late. The coin glinted in the moonlight, its surface reflecting the river's black depths as I held it out, willing it to break the demon's power. For a moment, nothing happened. The river remained still, the whispers quieted. I held my breath, praying that the ritual would work, that the demon's grip on me would finally shatter. Then, the water surged, rising in a violent, crashing wave, and the demon's form emerged once more, stronger and more furious than ever. "You cannot control me." The demon's voice was a roar, a force that shook the very ground beneath my feet. "I am the river. I am the darkness. I am eternal." The water began to swirl around me, pulling me closer to the river's edge. My body trembled as I fought against the current, trying to maintain my footing. It was like battling an invisible force that wrapped around my legs, threatening to drag me into the water. The demon was stronger now, angrier than ever, and I could feel its malice pressing in from all sides. But I wouldn't give up. I couldn't. In that moment, everything became clear. There was only one way to stop it, to make it believe I had no fear left to give. With a final, desperate cry, I hurled the coin into the river. The moment it hit the water, the air around me shattered like glass. The demon howled in rage, its form distorting, twisting as the coin disappeared beneath the surface. And then, silence. The water calmed, the river returning to its eerie stillness. The demon's presence was gone, like a shadow that had been erased from existence. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I had done it. I had won. But even as I caught my breath, I knew the battle wasn't truly over. The river was silent now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the demon had only been temporarily banished, that it would one day return. The darkness wasn't gone, it was only waiting, biding its time. And when it returned, it would be even more powerful than before. But for now, I had survived. And that, for me, was enough. The night was suffocating, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and the sound of the river whispering in the distance. But it wasn't the river that called to me now. It was the demon, its presence a shadow that had been lingering just beyond my reach since the first time I encountered it. And now, it was back, stronger than ever, as if the very earth had shifted beneath me, and I had no place to run. I stood at the edge of the river again, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath shallow. The coin had disappeared into the water, and for a brief moment, I thought the battle was over. But the darkness hadn't let me go. The demon had not been defeated, it had only been momentarily delayed, perhaps fooled by the offering, but it was far from finished. Now, it was coming for me. I could feel the river stirring beneath my feet, the water rippling in a slow, deliberate rhythm. My hands clenched at my sides, nails digging into my palms, but I didn't dare move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but I couldn't. I had to face it. This time, there would be no running, no tricks, no distractions. This was the final confrontation. The first hint of the demon's return came as a whisper, soft, barely audible at first, but then it grew louder, like the sound of a distant storm rolling in, bringing with it a sense of dread that settled deep in my bones. The air turned cold, so cold that it stung my skin, and I could see my breath in front of me, misting in the frigid night air. The water seemed to change, too. It grew darker, the surface no longer reflecting the pale moonlight, but instead rippling with an unnatural, oily sheen. It moved in strange, erratic patterns, like the water itself was alive, shifting, beckoning. I swallowed, forcing my mind to focus, to push past the mounting fear that threatened to overwhelm me. The demon was not a force of nature. It was something else. Something ancient, something that fed off the fear it provoked. And I could feel it feeding now, feeding off my own terror as I stood frozen at the edge of the river. "Come closer," the demon's voice hissed, echoing in my mind like 1,000 voices whispering at once. "You cannot hide from me any longer. You know I'm always watching." I flinched at the sound of my name, low and drawn out, like a warning. You think you can defeat me? You think you can escape me? I am the river. I am the darkness that follows you. The voice was everywhere now, inside my head, behind my eyes, and I could feel it clawing at my thoughts, digging deeper into my fears. It knew me. It knew my weaknesses. It knew how to break me. I tried to steady my breathing, to push back the panic that gripped my chest, but it was no use. The terror was like a wave crashing over me, drowning me, as the demon's form began to take shape in the water. It rose from the depths, its dark silhouette a monstrous thing that seemed to grow larger with every passing second. The eyes, I could see them now, glowing, malevolent, burning with an intensity that seemed to sear my soul. It wasn't just the physical terror of the demon that paralyzed me. It was the psychological torment, the whispers, the voices that crawled into my thoughts and twisted them into a nightmare. It was the feeling that the demon knew everything about me, my fears, my guilt, my regrets. And now it was going to make me face them. Look at me, the demon demanded. Look at what you've done. You cannot hide from me any longer. I could feel my knees shaking, my body trembling, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the water, from the figure rising up from the depths. Its voice was louder now, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. It was inside my head, inside my soul. You think you're strong, don't you? The demon taunted, its form growing closer, its shape becoming clearer. You think you can survive this, but you cannot fight me. I am the darkness that will consume you. I could hear my heartbeat now, pounding in my chest, so loud that it felt like it would burst. The fear, it was so much stronger now, stronger than it had ever been. And it wasn't just fear of the demon. It was fear of myself. Fear that I wasn't strong enough to defeat this, that I had no power left to fight back. You'll never escape me, the demon whispered, its voice like a cold breath on the back of my neck. You are mine. The darkness in the water shifted again, and for a moment it felt like the world around me was closing in. The trees, the riverbank, the sky, they all seemed to bend toward me, suffocating me in the demon's presence. But then something inside me shifted. A flicker of resistance. A surge of anger. I wasn't just going to let it win. I couldn't let it take me. Not now. Not after everything I had fought through. I am not yours, I muttered, my voice hoarse but steady. I won't be your prey. The demon roared in fury, its form rippling and shifting, the waters of the river churning violently, thrashing against the shore. The air around me crackled with energy, the ground beneath my feet trembling as if it, too, was being torn apart. And then, in the space between the demon's fury and my fear, I knew what I had to do. I would not just survive. I would destroy it. With everything I had, I forced myself to step forward, to step into the water, to face the demon head on. There was no going back now. Only one of us would walk away from this encounter. And I was willing to fight with every ounce of my being. The river rippled and writhed in front of me, its surface twisting as though the very water itself was alive. The demon's form towered over me, now clearer than ever. Its presence felt almost tangible, like a storm waiting to break, and yet, it wasn't the water that terrified me the most now, it was the mind games it was playing. I had always thought the demon was tied to the river, bound to the water and its dark depths. But now, standing in its presence, I realized I was wrong. The river wasn't just a place of power for the demon, it was a conduit. A conduit that stretched beyond the water, reaching into my thoughts, into the darkest corners of my mind. The whispers started again, low and steady at first, but they quickly grew louder, their tone shifting. No longer just threatening or mocking, they were insidious, manipulative. The demon wasn't just feeding off my fear. It was controlling it. "You're afraid," the voice murmured. "Afraid of what you can't control. Afraid of your own weakness. You always have been." My heart hammered in my chest as my thoughts began to fray at the edges. I could feel the demon's influence wrapping around me like a thick, suffocating fog, clouding my judgment, twisting my memories. It was as if the river's pull wasn't just physical anymore, it was mental. My mind felt heavy, sluggish, like the water was seeping into my skull, filling it with doubt and confusion. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog, but it wasn't enough. The demon's voice was a constant hum now, like a buzzing in my ears that I couldn't escape. "You're not strong enough to fight me," it taunted. "Look at yourself. You've always been weak. Too scared to face what's inside you." I clutched my head, trying to hold on to my thoughts, trying to keep myself grounded. The water lapped at my feet, cold and unyielding, as the demon's whispers turned into accusations, each word like a sharp blade against my psyche. "Remember what you did," it hissed. "You never faced the consequences. You ran from it. Just like you're running now." The memory came in a flash, dark, sharp, and painful. It was a part of my past I had buried, a mistake I had tried to forget. A mistake that haunted me, one that I had never fully dealt with. It was a truth I had locked away, but now it was being dragged to the surface, thrown in my face like a weight I couldn't ignore. The demon knew. It knew everything. It knew my guilt, my regrets, my darkest fears. And it was using them to break me. I staggered back, the air thick with the pressure of its presence. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the familiar landscape of the riverbank warping into something unrecognizable. The trees around me twisted, their shadows lengthening, as if the very world was reflecting my inner turmoil. "You can't hide from me," the demon purred. "I'll drag all your secrets into the light. All your fear. All your guilt. You're mine." I could feel my sanity slipping. My thoughts were unraveling, memories blending with the demon's whispers until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. I wanted to fight, but my mind was too clouded, too consumed by the darkness that surrounded me. The demon was breaking me from the inside. Its influence wasn't just over the water, it was over me. It was controlling my thoughts, twisting my mind into something unrecognizable. I was no longer sure what was real and what was just a figment of its power. The line between the physical and the psychological had blurred completely, and I was drowning in it. "You are nothing without me," the demon whispered, its voice soothing and sharp at once. "You're afraid of what you'll become. You're afraid of who you really are." The fear was suffocating now, my body trembling as the demon's words clawed at my soul. The whispers were relentless, a constant stream of doubt and terror, and I was losing myself in it. The water surged around my ankles, rising higher, as if the river itself was responding to the demon's power. I was caught in a web of fear and manipulation, and with each passing moment, I felt myself slipping further away from who I was. The battle was no longer just physical. The demon wasn't just a monster of flesh and water. It was a force of the mind, a parasite that fed on my deepest insecurities, my worst fears. It was changing me, bending me to its will, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "What will you do now?" The demon crooned. You can't fight me. You never could. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my thoughts, to focus on something, anything. The memories of my past, the fear, the shame, everything collided within me. But deep down, I knew that if I didn't break free now, I never would. The demon had planted the seeds of doubt so deeply in my mind that if I didn't act, it would consume me completely. With every ounce of willpower left inside me, I drew in a shaky breath, trying to push the whispers away. I had to fight this, not just physically, but mentally. The demon wanted me to break. It wanted to own me. But I had one weapon left, my resolve. I would not let it control me. I would not let it win. The river's cold grip tightened around my legs, its surface now churning with a fury that mirrored the chaos in my mind. The demon's presence loomed over me, its oppressive energy suffocating. It had reduced me to a trembling wreck, my thoughts fragmented and my body numb with fear. But somewhere, deep within the haze of terror, something shifted. I had learned about the demon's power, not just from the stories of locals, but from my own experience. It wasn't just a creature of the water, it was a creature of control, of manipulation. The more it fed on fear, the stronger it became, but it also had a weakness. It was bound by the very thing that gave it power, the water. It couldn't exist outside of it, not fully. It was a parasite, feeding off the river's energy to sustain itself. And in that moment, the realization hit me like a jolt of cold electricity. The demon wasn't just a shadow, it was a reflection of the water itself. The surface of the river was its doorway, its domain. But what if I could sever that connection? What if I could take away its power, if only for a moment? I steadied my breath, trying to push through the panic clawing at my chest. The whispers, "You're nothing, you can't escape," grew louder, but I ignored them. I had no time for doubt. The demon wanted me to break, to surrender. But I had to act. Now. My hands shook as I fumbled for the small knife I had brought with me, a feeble weapon in comparison to the power that surrounded me. But it was all I had. It was a sliver of hope, and hope was all I needed. I raised it above my head, my eyes fixed on the water's surface, the dark, swirling abyss that the demon inhabited. I didn't hesitate. I plunged the knife into the river, pushing it deep into the earth below. The action felt insignificant at first, nothing but a futile gesture against the sheer magnitude of what I was up against. But as the blade struck the water, a strange sensation rippled through me, a pulse of energy that seemed to come from both the blade and the river. The water shifted. The calm, unyielding force that had held me in place began to tremble, as if something was fighting against it. The demon's form wavered, its shape flickering like a distorted reflection. It howled in fury, but its voice was no longer as commanding, no longer as unshakable. The connection between it and the river had been disturbed, and for the first time, I felt like I had a chance. "You fool!" The demon's voice hissed in my mind. "You think you can stop me? You are nothing without me." I could feel its anger, its desperation as it tried to regain control. The water surged around me, pulling, tugging, threatening to drag me under. But I didn't falter. I held my ground, pressing the knife deeper into the riverbed, as if anchoring myself to something stronger than fear. "It's not the water that gives you power," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. "It's the fear. And I'm done being afraid." The moment the words left my mouth, something shifted again. The air grew colder, and the water seemed to freeze around me, stilling. For a fleeting instant, the demon's form disintegrated, the dark figure dissipating into the night like smoke, leaving only the eerie silence of the river behind. But that moment was all I needed. I turned and ran, the adrenaline surging through my veins as my body finally obeyed. The demon's grip loosened, the oppressive force that had been suffocating me fading, retreating back into the river's depths. The fear still clung to me like a shadow, but it wasn't as suffocating as before. My legs burned, my breath ragged, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't know if the demon was truly gone, or if it was just waiting for me to make a mistake. But for now, I had one. For now, I was free. As I reached the safety of the forest, my mind whirled with questions. Had I truly defeated the demon? Or had I only delayed the inevitable? The river, with its dark power, would always be there, always calling me. But I knew something now. Something I didn't understand fully, but something that gave me hope. The demon was bound to the water. And water, in the end, was a force of nature. It could be manipulated, shaped, and controlled, just like the fear it fed on. And as I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, I realized that I, too, could control it. I stumbled backward, the ground beneath me shifting as if it were no longer solid. My chest heaved, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins, but the relief I had felt moments ago was slipping away. The silence that had followed the demon's retreat was unnatural, suffocating. And then, I felt it. It wasn't the stillness of a calm night. It wasn't the peace that should have come after such a confrontation. It was a pressure. A heavy, unseen force that weighed down on me, making every breath feel like a struggle. The river, once simply a source of water and danger, now felt different. It was as though it had become aware of me, of my defiance. The water seemed to pulse. The air around me grew thick, the temperature dropping. My heart beat faster as I turned, the sense of being watched creeping up my spine once more. The demon might have faded, but the river was still here, and it was far more than just water. The wind shifted, rustling the leaves, but I could hear something else, something deeper, almost like a low rumble, vibrating beneath the surface of the river. It wasn't just a current, it was alive. My legs froze as the realization slammed into me with the force of a tidal wave. The river itself was a part of the demon. Not just a vessel or a home for it, but a living entity feeding the monster, feeding its power. I had been wrong to think I could simply break the connection. The demon was not just a creature tied to the river, it was the river, or at least, it had become one with it. The demon had been drawing strength from the river's lifeblood for centuries, and now that I had disturbed that bond, the river was fighting back. It wasn't just a passive bystander. It had awakened. I looked at the water again, my chest tightening. The surface was no longer smooth, it was churning, twisting as if it were alive, its depth swelling and contracting with a rhythmic pulse. The shadows beneath the water seemed to move, stretching, reaching, almost like arms trying to pull me back in. My mind raced, the connection becoming clearer. The river had always been the demon's power source, and in turn, it had fed off the fear of those who came near it. The more people who were afraid, the stronger the river became, the more alive it seemed. The demon had learned to feed off not just the water, but the fear it generated, the terror that would make the river stronger, feeding it like a parasite. The demon had been using the river as its host for so long that it had almost become one with it. "You're wrong to think you can stop me," the voice echoed in my mind, no longer just a whisper, but a thundering roar. "You cannot sever what you do not understand. The river is me, and I am the river. You are just a fleeting speck of dust. You cannot defeat me. I will always be here. I felt the pressure of the river tighten again, squeezing at my chest, suffocating me as if the very land itself was trying to drag me back into its depths. The ground beneath me seemed to be buckling, as though it were rising from the earth itself to trap me. The trees that once seemed so distant now felt oppressive, their branches reaching out like claws, their leaves whispering secrets that chilled me to the bone. The water surged forward, not just around me, but through me, seeping into the air, into the ground, into my very soul. The demon's power didn't just come from fear, it came from the river itself, an ancient, living entity that had existed long before I'd ever set foot near it. And now that I had disturbed it, it was fighting back with everything it had. The river wasn't simply a body of water. It was a force, a being that had learned to manipulate the fears of the living. It had learned to use the landscape itself to feed its hunger. It had bled into the earth, into the air, into the very bones of this place. The demon had no body, no true form, it had become a part of the world around it. And I had no idea how to stop it. "This is your end," the demon boomed, the water surrounding me now, rising, swirling, becoming a dark, menacing mass that reflected its malevolent eyes. "You can try to escape, but the river is my soul, and I will drown you in it." My heart pounded as the water rose higher, swallowing the ground, pulling the air from my lungs. I gasped for breath, feeling the crushing pressure of the river closing in around me. It was no longer just water, it was alive, a living, breathing entity that sought to consume me whole. And then, in that moment of raw terror, I realized something else. The river had always been alive. It had always been watching, listening, waiting. Its dark presence had seeped into every part of this land, into every soul that had ever crossed its path. The demon had only been a manifestation of the river's ancient hunger, a hunger that would never be satisfied. The true horror of what I was facing crashed into me with a brutal force. The river wasn't just a place. It wasn't just water. It was the embodiment of the fear that plagued this land, a fear that would never let go. And as the water closed in around me, I understood. There was no escaping it. The river was alive, and it would never let me go. I was drowning, not just in the water, but in my own terror. The river had consumed every part of me, my thoughts, my breath, my very soul. The water surged higher, pulling me deeper, pulling me into something darker, something older than anything I could comprehend. Its weight was suffocating, its presence overwhelming. I had reached the point of no return, the moment when the boundary between life and death had blurred into a suffocating nightmare. And yet, as the water swallowed me whole, something inside me fought to break free. I tried to scream, but the river filled my mouth, choked my voice. My vision blurred, the world around me spinning, becoming indistinct as the demon's laughter echoed in my ears. It was as if the river itself was laughing, mocking me for thinking I could escape, mocking me for ever believing that I could defeat it. But then, something shifted. The demon's presence, once all-encompassing and terrifying, seemed to waver. The pressure around me loosened, just enough for me to gasp, just enough for me to draw in a breath of air. And in that fleeting moment of clarity, I felt a sudden coldness. A chill so deep that it cut through the terror and seeped into my bones. It wasn't the cold of the river. It wasn't the chill of the night air. It was something different. I opened my eyes, blinking against the water that still churned around me. And what I saw made my blood run cold. The river's surface rippled, distorting into something unrecognizable. But it wasn't just the water, it was the reflection. The reflection of me. I gasped in shock. The figure that stared back at me from the water wasn't my own. It was another version of me. A twisted, pale, hollow-eyed version, its mouth twisted into a knowing smile. It was like staring into the depths of a mirror that reflected not the present, but a future. I was not just fighting the demon. I was fighting the version of myself that the demon had made. The reflection in the water was me, or rather, the me that would come to be if I were consumed by it. The water had not only fed the demon, it had fed on me. On my fear. On my weakness. The realization crashed into me with brutal force. This was not just about surviving. This was not about defeating the demon in some noble confrontation. The demon was me. It was my fear, my doubt, my darkest thoughts made flesh, and the river was its vessel. It had been there, deep inside me, feeding off my fears since the very beginning. The twisted reflection in the water was who I would become, a vessel for the demon's power. A puppet controlled by the river's ancient will. It wasn't just feeding on my terror, it was creating it, shaping it, until I became nothing more than a part of the demon's eternal hunger. I tried to fight it. I tried to scream, to claw my way out of the depths. But it was futile. I could feel the demon's presence surge through me, like a poison flowing into my veins, filling every part of me with its dark energy. My limbs grew heavy, my thoughts fragmented. I could feel myself slipping, like sand falling through an hourglass. The demon was not just a monster of the river, it was the essence of the river itself, and now it was taking over me. With one final, bone-chilling realization, I understood what had been happening all along. I had never been fighting the demon. I had been fighting myself, my own fear, my own dark thoughts made real. And now, it was too late. As the water closed around me, pulling me down into its depths, the reflection of myself in the river's surface grinned, a cold, hollow expression of triumph. The water was alive. And now, so was I. The last thing I felt before the darkness overtook me was the weight of the river, heavy, cold, and infinite, pulling me into its eternal embrace. The demon had won. And so had I. I woke to the feeling of wet earth beneath me, cold and unyielding. My body ached, my muscles stiff from a battle I could barely remember. My chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths, the air thick and suffocating. It took me a moment to gather my senses, to understand where I was. I was no longer in the river. I was on land. But something wasn't right. The silence was oppressive, as though the world around me had been frozen in time. No sounds of birds or rustling leaves. No hum of insects. Just the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears, frantic and desperate. I pushed myself up with trembling hands, my vision blurry at first. The world around me seemed distorted, like I was seeing through a fogged window. I was no longer by the river, but where was I? The ground was hard, cracked, and dry, with no sign of the water that had consumed me. No sign of the trees, the dark presence, the demon. I glanced down at my hands. They were clean, free of the river's dark residue. But the moment I looked at them, something twisted in my gut. The feeling was wrong. My hands were too still, too perfect. The weight of the air around me felt too heavy, pressing in from all sides, suffocating me with a new kind of dread. I looked around, desperate to make sense of everything. There were no signs of the demon, no shadowy figure stalking the banks. But the silence, the stillness, it was unnerving. My mind raced, piecing together the fragmented memories of the confrontation. I could see flashes of the water's dark surface, the reflection of my twisted self, the suffocating pull of the river. And then, nothing. Had I escaped? Had I somehow survived? The question lingered, but my body felt like it was betraying me. It didn't feel like I was truly here. It was as though I had come back from some other place, some other realm, and what I was experiencing now wasn't reality. I was broken. I stumbled to my feet, but my legs were unsteady, like they hadn't moved in years. I felt disconnected from my own body. Every step I took seemed to echo louder in my ears, and the ground beneath me felt wrong, like it wasn't really there. The trees seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, twisting and bending in unnatural ways. I shook my head, trying to clear the haze, but it only made things worse. A wave of nausea hit me, and I collapsed to my knees, my stomach lurching as if it were trying to expel something deep inside me. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, a constant pressure that weighed down on my chest. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I couldn't shake the sense that the world around me was wrong. I looked down at the earth again. There were cracks in the ground, long, jagged lines that seemed to stretch on for miles. The earth itself felt as though it had been torn, pulled apart. I could almost hear a faint whisper, a murmur from the depths of the earth. The river's voice, no, the demon's voice. It was there, in the back of my mind, whispering words I couldn't fully understand. I stood up, my hands trembling as I wiped the dirt from my face. My mind was slipping. I could feel it, a tightening in my chest that made it hard to think. A voice, so faint at first, then louder, clearer. You will never be free. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. The voice wasn't just in my head, it was coming from the earth itself. From the river. From the demon. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. The demon had never left. It had just changed. It wasn't just a creature tied to the river anymore. It had followed me, seeped into the very fabric of my being. I had not escaped. The demon was within me, and it would never let go. I staggered forward, desperate to run, but my legs felt weak, my body moving slower than I could control. The world around me seemed to close in, the trees bending closer, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. I could feel the demon's eyes on me, its presence like a cold hand at the back of my neck, pressing down with an unrelenting force. I had thought I had survived, but the truth was worse than I could have imagined. I had been broken. The confrontation had left me alive, physically, but it had shattered me. The demon had taken root inside me, and no matter where I went, it would be there, watching, waiting. I was no longer just a victim of the river. I was the river now. And the demon had won. I stumbled back into town, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and dread. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong, everything was wrong. But I needed answers. I needed someone to understand, to help me make sense of the nightmare that had unfolded. My body was battered, my clothes soaked and torn, but it was my mind that was the real casualty. The demon had left its mark on me, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that I was free, I knew the truth. I was changed. And it wasn't just in my head. I made my way to the local diner, where a few familiar faces lingered over coffee and small talk. The place was almost exactly how I remembered it, the smell of grease and burnt toast in the air, the hum of casual conversation, the soft clink of silverware. But it all felt hollow, like the life had been drained from it, leaving only the hollow shell of something once comforting. I sat down at the counter, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze on me, though no one spoke. I could feel their eyes on me, searching for answers, trying to piece together what had happened to me after I disappeared. They had seen the state I'd been in when I arrived back, disheveled, frightened, covered in mud, but no one said a word. It was as if the town was holding its collective breath, waiting for me to speak. I forced myself to look up, to speak, to tell them everything. Everything that had happened by the river, the terrifying figure, the whispers, the suffocating water. It was real, I said, my voice hoarse, trembling with a fear that refused to dissipate. There's something there. Something in the river. A demon. The silence that followed was deafening. People at the other tables shifted uncomfortably, exchanging looks. The waitress behind the counter barely raised an eyebrow. I'm serious, I continued, my voice rising as I felt the walls closing in. It's real. It's still there. It's inside me. But no one seemed to care. No one seemed to listen. One of the locals, a man I had known my whole life, let out a short laugh. Demon? What are you on about, kid? You've been through a hell of a lot, I know. But this town doesn't do demons. I stared at him, my heart racing, my body trembling. They don't get it. They won't ever get it. I could feel the weight of my own words slipping away as I spoke. The town didn't care. It couldn't care. The demon was real, but here, in this place, the world went on as if nothing had changed. A woman at the counter shook her head, muttering to herself. The river's always been strange, sure. But that doesn't mean, well, you know. They all went back to their meals, their conversations, as if the last few days hadn't happened. As if I had never vanished into the river. As if the town had never felt the growing unease that had clung to the air, heavier with each passing day. I was drowning in a different kind of silence now, one that made my throat burn. They didn't believe me. They couldn't. And I knew why. The town had always ignored the stories of the river, the strange things that happened around it. The disappearances. The oddities. It was all just folklore, rumors, things whispered behind closed doors. But now it was real. It had always been real. I tried again. You don't understand. The demon, it's still out there. It's not just the river. It's in me. No one reacted. No one cared. I could feel my chest tightening, my head growing light. My hands shook as I gripped the counter. It was like trying to scream into a void. They had no idea what I had seen, what I had faced. But they didn't want to know. They didn't want to believe. They couldn't accept it. The waitress poured me a cup of coffee, setting it in front of me without a word. She didn't even look me in the eye. I stared at the steaming mug, but all I could see was the reflection of myself in the dark liquid. The twisted version of me. The demon. It was still there, lurking behind my eyes, waiting for the next moment of weakness, the next opportunity to take control. I tried to speak again, but my words felt hollow. Useless. The people in the diner continued their conversations. The laughter, the clinking of cups, the scraping of chairs against the floor, it was all so normal. And that's when it hit me. The town had moved on. They were all so wrapped up in their own lives that they had no time to acknowledge what had happened. It was as if it had all been swept under the rug, forgotten like an old story told by the fire. They didn't want to know. They didn't want to hear about the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. They didn't want to understand the horrors that lived in the water, the demon that had nearly destroyed me. And, for some reason, that was the most terrifying part of all. The fact that they could go on while I was left behind. Shattered. Broken. Haunted. I stood up, leaving a few dollars on the counter, though I couldn't remember whether I even paid for the coffee. My head was spinning. My thoughts were a blur. The river, the demon, the twisted reflection of myself, everything was swirling together, suffocating me. As I walked out of the diner, I glanced back one last time. The town was the same. Nothing had changed. But I had. And I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to leave the river behind. Not really. Because it had followed me. And it always would. Days had passed since I tried to tell the town, since I reached out for someone, anyone, to help me understand what had happened. But no one cared. No one believed me. And now, even the silence of the town seemed to mock me. The streets, the familiar faces, all felt like a strange blur, as if I were living in some half-formed memory. But the river was still there. And it was calling to me. I could feel it in my bones, in the pit of my stomach, the undeniable pull to return. I tried to push it away, tried to live in the world that everyone else was so eager to continue. But that pull, that presence, never went away. It gnawed at me like hunger, like the slow, suffocating realization that no matter how far I ran, the river would always find me. It was late when I found myself walking toward the banks again. The sky hung low with thick clouds, casting a heavy gloom over everything. The air was colder than I remembered, and the wind carried with it a damp chill that bit at my skin. I walked without thinking, each step feeling heavier, like I was walking toward my own grave. When I reached the water, there was no sound. The river was unnaturally still, almost too still, as though holding its breath. It didn't even ripple. The once familiar rush of current seemed to have vanished, leaving behind a silent, watchful expanse of dark water. I stood there for a long time, watching. The demon's presence was so strong now. I could feel it just beneath the surface, like a weight pressing against me, suffocating me. My mind was racing, but my body wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the river, even though I knew what would happen next. It was as though the river itself had grown colder, more distant, more empty. And with that emptiness came a sense of dread, a chilling awareness that something was wrong, not just with the water, but with the world around me. I closed my eyes, hoping the darkness would offer some relief, some escape from the growing terror. But instead, the sounds came soft at first, like the distant whisper of wind through the trees. Then it became clearer, more distinct, the same whisper I had heard before, the one that crawled into my mind, the one that made me question whether I was losing my sanity. It was coming from the water, slithering up from the depths like a serpent, coiling around my thoughts. The water shifted. Slowly, as though it were reluctant to move, a ripple spread across the surface. And then, in the distance, a shadow began to form. It was faint at first, just a blur against the darkened water, but as it grew closer, it became undeniable. The same dark, looming figure that had haunted my dreams. The demon. I felt my heart begin to pound in my chest. The fear that had been dormant since my last encounter erupted all over again, drying out every rational thought. My legs felt like lead, and yet my feet seemed rooted to the ground. The whispers grew louder, and the chill from the river wrapped around me, tightening, suffocating. And then I heard it, the sound that had haunted me for so long. The water moving, not in a natural way, but with a strange, unnatural rhythm, like the pulse of something alive, something ancient. The demon was near. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and flee, but my body refused to obey. It was as though the river had already claimed me. It owned me. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the dark reality I had tried to escape from. The river had never let me go. The figure on the water grew clearer, and I could see its form more distinctly. The demon was not just a shadow now, it was something solid, something real. Its eyes, glowing like coals, fixed on me, and I knew then that it had been waiting for me. Watching me. Following me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The whispers in my mind were too loud, too overwhelming. The demon's presence was suffocating, drowning me in terror. The cold from the water reached deeper now, creeping up my legs, as if it were trying to pull me into the depths. I took a step back, but it didn't matter. The pull of the river was too strong. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as though the earth itself was beginning to give way. The demon smiled, or at least, that's what I thought it did. The twisted, contorted expression on its face sent a shock of icy fear through me. Its eyes never left mine. And the whispers grew louder, filling my mind with thoughts of hopelessness, of madness, of drowning in this place forever. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break free. But I knew I was already lost. The river had called me back, and I had answered. The only question now was how much longer I could hold on to my sanity before it, too, was swallowed whole. Days have blurred into each other since I returned from the river, but in my mind, everything is still clear. The images, the sounds, the feeling of being hunted, those sensations haven't faded. If anything, they've only grown sharper, more pronounced, as if each passing moment is another step toward my inevitable descent. I no longer sleep peacefully. I wake in the dead of night, my body drenched in sweat, the taste of salt water in my mouth, my heart racing as if I were still trapped in that moment by the river's edge. But it's not just the nightmares. It's the waking world, too. The air feels different, heavier somehow. The wind carries an unnatural chill, as though the demon's presence lingers in every gust. The town seems smaller now, like a cage, and I can't escape its walls. I try to tell myself that I'm imagining things, that it's just the trauma, the mind playing tricks. But deep down, I know better. There's no escaping it. The river isn't just a place anymore, it's part of me, a constant shadow that follows me wherever I go. And the demon? It's still out there, watching, waiting. Its eyes, glowing like burning coals, never leave me. Even when I close my eyes, I see them piercing through the darkness, a constant reminder that I'm not safe, not even in my own thoughts. The river has changed, too. It's no longer a peaceful, quiet place. I don't hear the rush of water like I once did, only an eerie silence, as if the river itself is holding its breath, waiting. It's not the same river anymore, it's something darker, something more malevolent. And I know, deep down, that it's calling me back. The demon's whispers have grown louder, more insistent. Sometimes I hear them in the wind, in the rustling of the leaves, in the creak of the trees. Other times, they come in my dreams, wrapping themselves around my thoughts, dragging me back to the water's edge, where the darkness waits. I can't escape it. I can't outrun it. The river has marked me, and the demon's gaze never falters. I feel it in the pit of my stomach, a constant pressure, a weight that pushes down on my chest. And though I try to convince myself that I'm free, that it's all over, I know I'm lying to myself. The demon has claimed me. It's not just a part of the river anymore, it's a part of me. I can feel it in my veins, in the rhythm of my pulse. There are moments when I think I hear the water calling my name. It's faint, barely perceptible, but it's there. And I know that, sooner or later, I'll have to return. I don't know why. I don't know how. But I can feel it in my bones. The river is waiting for me. And when the time comes, I'll have no choice but to answer. I'm no longer the person I was before I faced the demon. Something has broken inside of me, and I can feel it creeping into my thoughts like a slow poison. The fear, the terror, it's always there, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. It's not something I can outrun, not something I can escape. It's in me now. And the worst part? I know the demon is still watching. It's waiting for me to return. It always will be. I thought I was done with it. I thought that after all I had been through, after every agonizing moment of terror, that I could finally begin to heal. The nightmares, the whispers, the cold breath of the river, they were supposed to fade with time, right? But they never did. And now, as I sit here in the quiet, the chill in the air seems to grow more persistent, more real with every passing second. I had convinced myself that I survived, that the demon was gone. Perhaps it had retreated back into the river, vanishing like so many other nightmares when the light of day finally arrives. I even tried to believe that the town's indifference was proof of my survival, that no one else had suffered, that nothing more could happen. I was wrong. I woke this morning with a strange feeling. It wasn't the kind of unease I had grown accustomed to, the kind that accompanies a restless night or a lingering fear. No, this was different. It was a presence, a weight pressing down on me, the feeling of being watched. The feeling of being followed. At first, I thought I was imagining it again, the trauma taking its toll. But no! This time, it felt real. I went about my day, trying to shake the feeling, but every glance over my shoulder only confirmed my fear. I couldn't escape it. The town looked the same, the sun shining down as if everything were normal, but I knew better. My pulse quickened with every step I took, every corner I turned. The demon had never left. And then it happened. As I passed the edge of the river, just for a moment, just for an instant, I saw it. A shadow, long and undulating, stretching across the water like a serpent slithering through the murk. The figure stood there, motionless, as if it were waiting for me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to look away, but my eyes couldn't move. That feeling, the one I had tried so hard to suppress, surged back into my mind with a force that nearly broke me. The whispers came, just a soft murmur at first, like the breeze across the surface of the river. But then they grew louder, sharper, unmistakable. I turned away quickly, my mind screaming for me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, just as I had been before. The river, the demon, it was all too much. I was trapped, caught in the web of my own terror. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The water stirred. It was subtle at first, a small ripple across the surface. But as I watched, the ripple grew, spreading across the water, moving in unnatural patterns. Something was moving beneath it. Something alive. And then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, faint at first, but unmistakable. The demon's gaze was fixed on me, even now, even after everything. It hadn't been defeated. It hadn't retreated. It had only been waiting, patiently, for me to believe that I was safe. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. The demon was never gone. It was always there, beneath the surface, watching, waiting for its next victim. And I had been foolish enough to think that I could escape it, that I could walk away. The whispers intensified, now a cacophony of voices swirling around me, drowning out everything else. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears, but I could already feel the weight of it behind me, creeping closer with every step I took. The final twist? There was no escape. The demon had always been part of me, part of this place. It was bound to the river, bound to the land, and now, so was I. There was no ending to this. No peace. No escape. And as I ran, the realization settled deep within me, this was my fate. The river would never let me go. The demon would never stop watching. And neither would I. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.